first thing he felt was the taste of blood in his mouth, then pain in his back, then the smell. Burnt fat and red-hot coals, and something else. Something ancient. Ethan opened his eyes and saw a ceiling of blackened logs above him. He was lying face down on a pile of rusty scrap metal. Sharp edges dug into his cheek and ribs. The hands were not his own. Thin, covered in calluses and old burns. The nails were broken down to the flesh. He tried to stand up and immediately got kicked in the side. Standing over him was a burly man in a leather apron with a crimson face, yelling so loudly that the walls shook. Ethan didn't know the language, but for some reason, every word sank into his mind as if it were his own. The man was screaming that Ethan was a freeloader, that 3 swords hadn't been sharpened all night, and that he wouldn't be seeing any dinner. Ethan sat down. His head was buzzing. He looked at his hands again. These weren't his hands. Not the hands of a 29-year-old engineer. These were the hands of a boy. A skinny boy. A hungry boy. A beaten boy. His body remembered how to hold a file. His body remembered the pain of burns, and the taste of stale bread, and the smell of that blacksmith shop. But Ethan remembered something else. He remembered the formulas. Melting points, phase diagrams of iron-carbon alloys. He remembered his dissertation on extracting rare earth elements from electronic scrap. He remembered the lab in Pittsburgh, and the double shifts, and the fatigue in his eyes, and the truck's headlights on the windshield. And the sign on the side of the truck. Recycling. The man in the apron swung at him again. Ethan grabbed his wrist without a second thought. The man froze. Apparently the kid had never done that before. Ethan let go of his hand and stood up silently. The blacksmith shop was small and dirty. 2 furnaces. One of them was cracked. An anvil with dents. A barrel of murky water for quenching. The wall was hung with tools. Half of them were dull. The other half were rusty. A sword lay on the workbench, broken right at the hilt. And then Ethan saw what no one else could see. A thin, golden frame flashed before his eyes. It traced the outline of the blade. Inside the frame, lines of glowing text began to scroll. Low-quality steel. Carbon content, 0. 4%. Hidden property, 4% vanadium in the impurities. Potential with proper reforging. Resonant class cutting edge. Requires reforging at 840 degrees. Add bone ash to bind the impurities. Quench in oil. Temper twice at 200 degrees. Ethan blinked. The text didn't disappear. It hovered before his eyes like a hologram. Quiet. Patient. Waiting. Ethan looked at the broken sword, then at his hands, then at the dirty ceiling of the forge. And for the first time all morning, he smiled. The man in the apron took a step back. Apparently, the boy hadn't smiled before either. The man's name was Borch. He was the owner of the blacksmith shop called the Rusty Nail. The shop stood on the outskirts of the craftsmen's quarter in the capital, Cairvin, between a garbage dump and a sewer ditch. Borch had once been an apprentice to the apprentice of a real blacksmith. He didn't really know how to forge anything himself, but he knew how to drink, and how to beat the orphaned boy he'd taken in 3 years ago. Not out of pity, but because a free worker is a free worker. Ethan knew all this. His body remembered. The boy's memory sat somewhere at the back of his skull, tossing up facts like index cards. Borsch beats him in the evenings when he's drunk. Borsch takes all his money. Borsch promised to teach him how to forge, but never did. Borsch fears the Hammer Guild like the plague. The Hammer Guild. Ethan already knew what that was. A secret order of blacksmiths. Craftsmanship is passed down through bloodlines. The path is closed to commoners. The most an orphan with no surname could hope for was to sharpen other people's blades in a filthy basement. Ethan looked at the workbench, at the broken sword, at the golden threads hanging in the air, and he began to work. He picked up a file. The boy's hands knew the basic movements. Ethan added to them something that no master in this world knew. He knew where to apply pressure. He knew at what angle to remove the metal. He knew that vanadium impurities weren't a curse, but a gift. In his past life, vanadium steel was used for surgical instruments and race car springs. Here, this sword was considered junk. Borsch had tossed it onto the workbench a week ago and said the customer wouldn't even pay to have it melted down. Ethan worked for 3 hours. He didn't reforge the blade. He lacked both the strength and the skill for that, but he removed the old cutting edge and smoothed out the bevels. He found a bone scrap on the floor, burned it to ashes in the corner of the forge. He rubbed the ash into the blade's surface and heated it to a temperature he estimated by eye. The golden interface provided the exact figures. The boy's hands couldn't do everything that was required, but even half the recipe transformed the dull shard into something else. When Ethan finished and dipped the blade into the water barrel, a sound rippled through the forge, high-pitched, clear, like a tuning fork. Borscht dropped his mug. He'd been standing in the corner, drinking since morning, but that sound sobered him up instantly. He walked over, looked at the blade, ran his finger along the edge and pulled his hand back. A drop of blood appeared on his fingertip. Borscht looked at Ethan. There was something in his eyes that Ethan couldn't place from his childhood memories. Fear. Not malicious fear, not the kind he'd used to beat him with in the evenings. Something else. Borscht asked quietly what Ethan had done to the sword. Ethan shrugged and said he'd simply calculated the heat treatment correctly. Borscht didn't understand a word. He took the sword. That evening, he returned with a small bag of coins. The customer had paid triple the price. Borscht counted out 2 copper coins for Ethan from the 30 silver ones. Ethan took them. For now, 2 copper coins were better than nothing. The next morning, the first real customer arrived. Not for Borscht, for Ethan, an old soldier named Garin. He limped on his left leg and held a rag bundle in his hands. He unwrapped it. Inside lay a bronze sword guard. Just the guard. No blade, no hilt. Garin said it was all that remained of his son's weapon. His son had died a month ago on the eastern frontier, in battle against the creatures of the rusty waves. The sword had dissolved in the monster's acidic blood. Only the guard remained because his son had clutched it until the very end. Garin asked to have the bronze remelted and turned into at least some kind of knife. A kitchen knife. A small one. He didn't even have enough money for that. Ethan took the hilt in his hands. The golden interface flashed. Bronze. An ordinary alloy. Nothing of value. But on the surface was dried blood that had seeped into the micro cracks. The interface displayed a message that Ethan read twice. The bearer's blood is bound to the metal at the molecular level. During reforging, memory resonance is possible. The finished product will retain the owner's imprint. Ethan looked at Garin. The old man stood with a stony expression. Only his hands were trembling. Ethan decided not to remelt the hilt. He carefully scraped the layer of blood off it. He annealed the bronze. He reshaped it. He incorporated what he'd scraped off into the new knife. The work took the whole day. Borscht went out for a drink at lunchtime and didn't return. Ethan worked alone. By evening, a simple kitchen knife lay on the workbench. Short, with a wooden handle. Nothing special to look at. Garin returned at sunset. Ethan handed him the knife. The old man took it in his hand and froze. His face changed. His lips trembled. He pressed the knife to his chest and closed his eyes. Then he said the knife was warm, as if his son were standing right there. Ethan replied that it was just the right heat treatment. Garin left a handful of copper coins on the workbench. It was all he had. Ethan tried to give it back. Garin shook his head and walked away. That night, a basket of hot bread appeared on the blacksmith's doorstep. Another one the next morning. By the end of the week, the whole neighborhood was abuzz. At the Rusty Nail, there's a young boy who repairs not iron, but memories. Rumors spread faster in poor neighborhoods than at the royal palace. 3 days after the incident with Garin, a line had formed outside Rusty Nail's. It wasn't long, about 5 people, but for a blacksmith shop tucked away in the back alleys between a garbage dump and a ditch, this was unheard of. First came a carpenter with an axe whose handle had split. Next came a woman with a bent sickle. Then a boy of about 10 with a fishing hook. Then 2 more. All of them poor. All with items a normal blacksmith wouldn't touch. Ethan would. He ran every item through the golden interface. The carpenter's axe turned out to be interesting. Ordinary iron. But there was an arc-shaped crack in the blade. The interface showed that the crack wasn't caused by an impact. The metal was fatigued. The crystal lattice had deformed from years of vibration. Ethan knew what that meant. On Earth, he would have called it fatigue failure. Here, he said that the spirit of the metal was asking for rest. The carpenter nodded. Ethan heated the blade, not until it was white hot, but until it was a dark cherry red. 720 degrees. He held it for a minute. Then he slowly let it cool in the air. Normalization. The simplest procedure from a heat treatment course. The crack hadn't disappeared, but the interface showed that the internal stresses had been reduced by 80%. The axe would last another 2 years if he didn't use it to chop stones. The carpenter paid 4 copper coins and left satisfied. Bork watched from the corner. He hadn't beaten Ethan for 3 days now. Not because he'd become kinder, because he was afraid. Every evening he collected the day's takings and headed to the tavern. He'd return around dawn, staggering. He'd lie down in silence and snore until noon. Ethan used those hours. He explored the blacksmith shop, every piece of metal on the shelves, in the corners, and under the workbench. The interface scanned everything. Most of it was junk, even by this world's standards. Low-grade iron with high sulfur and phosphorus content. Brittle. Fragile. But in one corner, Ethan found something. A box of old horseshoes. 23 of them. Bork had been keeping them to remelt, but he never got around to it. Ethan scanned each one. 17 out of 23 were ordinary iron, but 6 of the horseshoes contained traces of nickel, ranging from 0.5 to 1.2%. In his world, nickel steel was used for armor plates and ship propeller shafts. Here, these horseshoes were worth less than dirt. Ethan set them aside. For now, he couldn't do anything complicated with them. His hands were those of a boy. Basic sharpening, simple straightening, heating and cooling, but real forging. Drawing out a strip. Strike with the hammer precisely and rhythmically. Weld the layers together. He lacked both the strength and the technique for that. He needed a blacksmith, a real one, with strong hands and a well-behaved hammer. Someone who would strike exactly where Ethan told him to. On the 5th day, she arrived. Ethan was sitting on the threshold, eating a stale flatbread. The sun was setting. The line had dispersed an hour ago. Borch had gone off to drink. A girl was walking down the street, tall, muscular, black hair tied in a bun, 2 empty scabbards on her belt. Her clothes were worn but had once been expensive. Her gait was confident, but her right shoulder was slightly lower than her left. Ethan noted this automatically, an engineer's habit, to notice asymmetry. The girl approached and tossed a bundle onto the workbench. She unwrapped it. A sword. Long, single-edged, broken in half. The crack ran diagonally from the middle of the blade to the hilt. She said she needed to have it repaired. She said she didn't have much money but could pay with work. She said her name was Hyo-jin. Ethan picked up the fragments. The interface flashed gold. It displayed so much information that Ethan forgot to breathe for a second. Medium quality steel, carbon content 0.6%, traces of molybdenum. The blade was hand-forged, a craftsman of above-average skill. The blade is approximately 80 years old. It had been passed down through generations. But the interface revealed the most important detail, the nature of the fracture. The crack wasn't accidental. It originated from a microscopic stress point on the hilt, where the metal had been overheated during the last repair. Someone had repaired this sword before and made a mistake. But that wasn't all. The interface opened a separate panel that Ethan was seeing for the first time, a compatibility analysis between the weapon and its owner, based on wear patterns. Ethan stared at the lines. The wear on the hilt indicated that the owner held the sword with a wrist grip, short, quick strikes with a lot of wrist action. But the blade was designed for shoulder-level cuts, long, wide swings. The weight was distributed for a power-based style. Ethan looked up at Hyo-jin. Her right shoulder was lower. Her forearm muscles were more developed than her biceps. The callus on her palm was closer to the base of her fingers than to the center. It all added up. She was fast, precise, skilled. But the sword demanded that she be heavy-handed and rough. She was breaking it, not because she was bad. She was breaking it because she was too good for it. Ethan asked who had taught her to fight. Hyo-jin tensed up. She said her father. Ethan asked who had chosen the sword. She said her grandfather had, for her father, and her father had given it to her. Ethan nodded. It was all clear. 3 generations and not a single one matched the style of the next. He told her he wouldn't repair the sword. Hyo-jin clenched her fists. Her eyes grew cold. She decided he was refusing because she didn't have any money. Ethan shook his head and said that repairing this sword was pointless, because it wasn't right for her. It would break again, after 50 fights, maybe sooner, at the exact same spot, because she strikes with her wrist, but the blade wants her shoulder. Hyo-jin froze. No one had ever told her that. Never. Not a single master. Not a single instructor. Her whole life, she'd thought she broke swords because she wasn't strong enough. Ethan suggested something else. To reforge a single blade into 2. A pair of short swords, tailored to her actual technique. Lighter, faster, shorter, balanced for her wrist. He couldn't do it himself. His hands were too weak for such forging. But he could calculate everything. Every blow of the hammer, every degree of heat, every second of tempering. All he needs is someone to swing them. Hyo-jin looked at him for a long time. Then she asked why he was telling her this. He could have just fixed it and taken the money. Ethan replied that the repaired sword would kill her. Maybe not tomorrow, but soon. It would break in battle when it mattered most, and she would die with a shard in her hand, just like her father. Hyo-jin turned pale. Ethan realized he'd hit the nail on the head. Her father had died exactly that way. She was silent for a minute. Then she sat down on the threshold next to him. She asked when to start. Ethan said, "Tomorrow at dawn. We need a bell, we need coal, we need a hammer heavier than the one in the smithy, and we need bone ash, a lot of it." Hyojin said she'd get it. She stood up and left without looking back. Borch returned that night, drunk. He saw the shards of the sword on the workbench and grumbled that Ethan was taking on orders he couldn't fulfill. Ethan said nothing. In the morning, Hyojin arrived before dawn. She brought a sack of bones, sheep bones. She'd bought them from the butcher with her last few coins. She also brought a hammer, a heavy one with a short handle. She didn't say where she'd gotten it. Ethan stoked the forge and burned the bones to ash. He laid out the sword fragments on the anvil. He opened the interface and saw everything he needed: temperature, angles, sequence. He stood next to Hyojin and began telling her where to strike. She raised the hammer. The first blow was hesitant. She wasn't a blacksmith, she was a swordswoman, but her coordination was flawless. By the third blow, she'd found her rhythm. Ethan gave instructions. "Here, harder. Now softer. Turn 2 fingers to the left. Stop. Let's heat it up." He sprinkled bone ash onto the red-hot metal. The carbon from the ash seeped into the surface. Carburization, the oldest technique in the history of metallurgy. But no one here had ever used it that way. Here, blacksmiths worked by eye and instinct. Ethan worked by the numbers. They forged for 4 hours. Borch woke up 2 hours in. He walked over. He wanted to say something mean. He saw Hyojin striking with the hammer while Ethan stood nearby, directing like a conductor. Borch sat down in a corner and watched in silence. By noon, 2 blades lay on the anvil, short, slightly curved, single-edged. Ethan had finished the cutting edge himself with a file. His hands were good for at least that much. He tempered both blades in oil. The interface confirmed: cutting edge, resonance class, hardness, 58 units, core toughness, sufficient. Expected service life under intensive use, 1,200 battles. Ethan handed the blades to Hyojin. She took them, one in each hand, and froze. Her expression changed, just like Garen's had when he took the knife, but different. Garen had found a memory in the knife. Hyojin found herself in the swords. She made a test swing, then a second, then a series. The blades sliced through the air with a faint whistle. Every movement was natural, effortless. Right. For the first time in her life, the weapon didn't resist her. For the first time, she wasn't struggling with her own sword. Hyojin stopped. She looked at Ethan. Her eyes sparkled. She said she'd never felt anything like it. Ethan replied that it was simply a matter of proper balance and weight distribution. Hyojin didn't understand a word, but she smiled, for the first time during the entire conversation. She asked how much she owed. Ethan named a price, a ridiculous one, just the cost of the coal and bones. Hyojin shook her head. She said she'd be back tomorrow with the full payment. Ethan said it wasn't necessary. Hyojin replied that it wasn't up for discussion, and she left. Bork approached Ethan once the door closed. He was sober for the first time in a week. He asked where Ethan had learned all this. Ethan looked him in the eye and said he'd read books. Bork didn't believe him, but he didn't argue. That evening, he didn't go to the tavern. He sat in a corner, staring at the anvil. Then he said quietly that Ethan had accomplished more in a week than he had in his entire life. There was no anger in his voice. There was emptiness. Ethan said nothing. He knew that sound. The sound of a man who realized he'd lived his life wrong. That night, Ethan didn't sleep. He lay on his straw mat in the corner of the smithy and thought. He had to decide what to do next. The golden interface was working. His hands were still weak, but he didn't necessarily have to do the forging himself. He needed people, a blacksmith with strong hands. For now, it was Hyojin, but she was a swordswoman, not a blacksmith. He needed a true master. He needed materials, not the junk from Bora's crate, but something substantial. He needed money. He needed protection from the Hammer Guild, which would find out sooner or later. Ethan closed his eyes. In the darkness, the golden lines of the interface flashed. He remembered the inscription on the truck. Recycling. He'd spent his whole life turning trash into treasure. Back then, on Earth. Now, here. Only the stakes had gotten higher. Hyojin returned 2 days later. Not with money, with a job. She brought 3 people with her. 2 soldiers from the city guard and 1 mercenary. All 3 had problems with their weapons. The first soldier's sword bent with every strike. The second soldier's spearhead was so crooked on the shaft that when he threw it, it veered 3 palms to the left. The mercenary's chainmail was coming apart on his right side, and he paid a blacksmith every month to repair it. Hyojin told them that there was a master at the rusty nail who could see things. The soldiers looked at Ethan. At a skinny 19-year-old boy in a scorched apron. at a filthy smithy between a garbage heap and a ditch. The first soldier snorted. The second turned toward the exit. The mercenary stayed. His chainmail had cost him too much anxiety to walk away without giving it a try. Ethan took the chainmail in his hands. The interface popped up. Iron rings. Riveted. About 12,000 rings. The carbon content was uneven. Some of the rings were made of soft iron. Some were made of medium carbon steel. The problem was obvious. The chainmail had been repaired at least 5 times, each time by a different blacksmith. Each had used his own metal. The right side was coming apart because soft rings were placed next to hard ones there. Upon impact, the soft ones stretched, the hard ones held firm. A gap formed between them, and the seam tore. Ethan told the mercenary that he didn't need to repair the chainmail. He needed to replace 18 rings in the transition zone. He needed to insert medium hardness rings that would act as a buffer between the soft and hard ones. The mercenary asked how Ethan knew exactly which rings to use and how many of them. Ethan replied that he had a good eye. The job took an hour. Ethan pulled out the 18 rings. He found wire of the right thickness in Borja's supplies. The interface showed that its carbon content was 0.35%, right between soft iron and steel. Ethan bent 18 new rings. He riveted them into place. He heated the repair area and let it cool in the air. The mercenary put on the chainmail. He moved around a bit. He punched himself in the side with his fist. He grunted. The rings held. He paid silently. A silver coin. The first silver coin Ethan had ever earned on his own. The 2 soldiers who were leaving stopped in the doorway. They'd seen everything. They came back. Ethan had repaired the sword in 20 minutes. The problem was that the blade had been tempered incorrectly. It had been cooled too quickly. The martensite had turned out brittle. Ethan retempered it in oil instead of water, and the sword stopped bending. The spear was more complicated. The tip itself was fine. The problem was how it was attached. The shaft had dried out, and the tip was loose. Ethan removed the tip. He carved a new cone from a block of wood. He fitted it with the precision provided by the interface. He set the tip in place. He secured it. The spear flew straight. The soldiers left. But that evening, one of them returned. He brought 4 more with him. By the end of the second week, Ethan was serving 5 to 8 customers a day. Small orders, repairs, adjustments, sharpening. Nothing legendary, but every item left in better condition than when it arrived, and every customer told 2 others. Borch counted the money every evening. Revenue had increased 6-fold. Borch drank less, not because he decided to quit, because he didn't have time. Customers came from morning till night. Borch took orders and handed out the finished items. Ethan worked. They hardly spoke. Something heavy and unspoken hung between them. Borch knew that Ethan could leave at any moment, open his own forge, or go work for any of the city's other blacksmiths. But Ethan stayed, and Borch didn't know why. Ethan didn't know either. Maybe it was because the boy's body remembered those 3 years in this forge, the beatings, the hunger, and the cold nights. But also the warmth of the furnace, the smell of coal, and the first time Borch had placed a file in his hands and shown him how to use it. Borch was a bad man, but he was the only person the boy had. Miriam arrived in the 3rd week. Ethan remembered that day because it was raining. A cold autumn rain that turned the capital, Caravan, into a muddy swamp. Miriam walked into the blacksmith shop without knocking, soaked to the bone. Tall, thin. Her light hair clung to her face. On her back was a sack made of coarse leather, heavy. She tossed it onto the floor. The sack clattered. Miriam said she'd been told that strange things were bought here. Ethan replied that he wasn't a merchant. He was a blacksmith. Miriam looked at him in silence. Then she untied the sack. Inside were bones. Not sheep's, not cow bones. The bones of a creature Ethan had never seen. Long, black, with a bluish sheen. Some were hollow inside, with thin walls stronger than steel. The interface exploded with information. Bone of the first beast. Material class, legendary. Calcium content, 12%. The rest, unknown mineral composite. Tensile strength, 2.4 times that of dragon steel. Heat resistance, up to 1,600 degrees without degradation. Compatibility, high with carbon steel when a phosphate binder is added. Source of the phosphate binder, river silt. Ethan stared at the bones, then at Miriam, then back at the bones. He asked where she'd gotten them. Miriam said she'd killed a beast in the wastelands 3 weeks ago. She brought the carcass to the Hunters Guild. They'd taken the hide, the claws, and the core. They told her to throw the bones away. Miriam didn't throw them away. Her whole life, she'd felt that the rest wasn't trash. But no one believed her. Ethan picked up one bone. He turned it over in his hands. He ran his finger along its surface. Smooth, hard, warm to the touch, even though Miriam had carried the bag in the rain. He told her that this beast's bones were an extremely rare material, that a single bone like this could be forged into a blade that would outlast any sword made of dragon steel, that she was a genius for not throwing them away. Miriam stared at him, then she looked away. Ethan noticed that her ears had turned red. She asked how much he would pay. Ethan named his price. Everything he'd earned in 2 weeks. Miriam said it was too much. Ethan replied that it was too little. They settled on a middle ground. Miriam left. She stopped at the doorway. She asked if he needed anything else. Ethan said he did. Anything she could find. Bones, claws, scales, fur, horns, anything the Hunters Guild considered waste. He'd buy it all. Miriam nodded and walked out into the rain. Ethan put the bones in the farthest corner of the smithy, wrapped them in rags, covered them with an old apron. Borch wasn't supposed to know. Not yet, anyway. Not because Ethan didn't trust him, because Borch drank. And drunkards talk too much. That night, Ethan stared at the bones for a long time by the light of the dying forge. The interface flickered quietly with golden lines. He knew that these bones could be used to make things no one here had ever heard of. But he needed time. He needed tools he didn't have. He needed a real blacksmith, not a swordswoman with a hammer. He needed an alchemist to extract the binding agents. He needed a distribution network. He needed protection. He lay on the straw and drew up a plan. In a month, he had to buy out Borch's smithy, or at least get his share. In 2 months, he would find a blacksmith partner. In 3, he would begin working with the bone of the first beast. In half a year, he would reach a level where the Hammer Guild wouldn't be able to simply crush him. The plan was sound, but plans rarely survive a collision with reality. Reality arrived 3 days later, in the form of an inspector from the Hammer Guild. The inspector's name was Derek Ferrone, the youngest nephew of the youngest branch of a great family. Short, fat, with beady eyes and a Hammer Guild ring on every finger. He didn't come alone. Behind him stood 2 apprentices from the guild, broad-shouldered, with hammers on their belts. Not for forging, for persuasion. Derek walked into the smithy like he owned the place. He looked around, ran his finger along the workbench, looked at his finger, grimaced. Borch stood by the wall, pale, sober. His hands were shaking. He knew what a visit from the inspector meant. Derek said rumors had reached the guild, that at the Rusty Nail Smithy, someone was taking orders without a license, that someone was undertaking work beyond their rank, that someone was using methods not approved by the masters. Borch began to say it was a mistake, that he simply sharpened knives and repaired horseshoes. Derek wasn't listening. He was looking at Ethan, the boy in the scorched apron standing by the anvil, saying nothing. Derek asked who he was. Borch said he was his apprentice, an orphan with no name or family. Derek walked over to Ethan and stood close to him. He smelled of sandalwood and sweat. He asked if it was true that the boy repaired weapons. Ethan replied that it was. Derek asked who had taught him. Ethan replied that he'd taught himself. Derek laughed. So did the apprentices behind him. Then Derek stopped laughing. He took the first blade he could find off the wall, a short knife, one of the ones Ethan had made for customers last week. He turned it over in his hand, ran his fingernail along the edge. He froze. He looked at Ethan differently. Derek knew metal. He was a mediocre blacksmith, but he'd been taught by the world's finest masters. He could tell good work from bad, and this wasn't just good work. The edge was smooth with a precision Derek had only seen in the first circle masters of the guild. The steel's grain suggested a heat treatment he couldn't identify. The knife was made of shoddy iron. But that shoddy iron behaved like good steel. Derek put the knife back. His face hardened. He declared that the forge was violating the Hammer Guild's charter. Paragraph 17. Prohibition on forging and repairing weapons without a guild license. Paragraph 31. Prohibition on the use of unapproved metalworking methods. Paragraph 44. Prohibition on outcasts working with materials of higher quality than third-grade iron. Fine. 20 gold pieces. Or closure. 20 gold pieces. Ethan quickly did the math. That was his revenue for half a year at the current rate. Borch exhaled as if his spine had been pulled out. Derek added that the fine could be waived, if the boy showed how he'd achieved such a sharp edge, if he shared the method. The method would be passed on to the guild and registered under the Ferrone family name. The boy would receive a certificate of appreciation and 5 silver coins. Ethan understood. This wasn't an inspection, it was theft. Derek had seen the quality of the knife and wanted to steal the technology, to claim it for his family, to get a promotion in the guild, maybe even a spot in the inner circle. Ethan looked at Derek and said there was no method, just a good file. Derek didn't believe him. He nodded to the apprentices. One of them stepped toward Ethan. He placed a hand on his shoulder, a heavy hand, a threatening one. Derek said the boy had 3 days to show a method, or the forge would close, and the boy would be sent to the quarries for violating the guild's charter. They left. Borch sat down on the floor. Literally, his legs wouldn't hold him up. He said it was the end, that you don't argue with the guild, that they had to run. Ethan didn't listen. He thought. 3 days. He had 3 days to find a solution. He wasn't going to run away. Running away meant losing the forge, losing his clients, losing the bones of the first beast hidden in the corner, losing everything he'd been building for 3 weeks. He stepped out onto the street. It was cold. Evening was falling. Ethan walked through the neighborhood. He didn't know where he was going. He just walked. He thought. In his world, he'd solved similar problems. When a major company wanted to steal his lab's patent, when his superiors demanded he hand over research results without acknowledging his authorship, the solution was always the same. Make yourself more indispensable than what they want to steal. Ethan stopped. He stood in front of a large building in the center of the craftsmen's quarter. The sign read, Royal Armory. It was where the army purchased weapons. A cart stood in front of the building, loaded with broken swords, dozens of blades, hundreds of them, all damaged. Many bore traces of corrosion that Ethan had never seen before. Rust-colored spots with a greenish tint. The metal around the spots crumbled like dry cookies. Ethan stepped closer. He activated his interface, and a chill ran down his spine. This wasn't ordinary corrosion. It was a chemical trace, an acidic environment containing rare earth elements, lanthanum, cerium, neodymium, elements that aren't found in such concentrations in nature. These swords had been in battle with the rusty waves, creatures from the eastern frontiers. Their bodies are covered in a mineral crust that dissolves ordinary steel. And the interface showed why. The creature's acidic environment contained substances identical to slag waste, industrial slag waste, as if someone had been dumping spent metallurgical waste in one place for centuries, and it had mutated. Ethan stepped back from the cart. His heart was racing. He was a materials engineer. He'd spent his entire career working with industrial waste. He knew what the consequences of improper disposal looked like. On Earth, it was poisoned rivers and dead zones. Here, it was monsters. Someone had created the rusty waves. Not nature, not magic. Someone had been dumping contaminated metal and slag into the eastern lands for centuries, and the Earth had responded. Ethan memorized the chemical composition, every element, every proportion. It was proof. He didn't know exactly what it proved yet, but he knew it was important. He returned to the forge. Borch was sleeping on the floor. An empty bottle lay nearby. Ethan sat down at the workbench and began to think. He needed a trump card, something that would make Derek Ferrone irrelevant, something that would put up a wall between him and the Hammer Guild, one they couldn't break through. He needed a patron. The next morning, Ethan did something he'd never done before. He took one of the knives he'd made, the best one, the one he'd made for himself from a scrap of steel with a high chromium content. The knife didn't rust. It didn't dull. It held its edge like a razor. Ethan wrapped it in a clean cloth and headed for the upper city, where those who could protect him lived. He walked for 2 hours, through the artisans' quarter, through the shopping arcades, across the bridge over the Silver River. Each neighborhood was wealthier than the last. The houses were taller, the streets were cleaner, the guards were harsher. At the entrance to the aristocratic quarter, they stopped him. They asked where he was going and why. Ethan said he was delivering an order. They let him through. He didn't know exactly where he was going. He didn't know to whom he was delivering the knife. He just walked and looked around. The interface worked even on the street. He could see the metal composition of the gates on the mansions, the quality of the horses' horseshoes, the alloy from which the doorknobs were cast. He walked and read the city like an open book. And then he saw her. A young woman was standing at the entrance to a jewelry shop. Young, maybe 17 or 18. Her clothes were simple, but the fabric was expensive. A hooded cloak hid her face, but Ethan wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at her hands. She was clutching something small in her hands, something metallic, and she was crying. Quietly. Silently. Only her shoulders were shaking. Ethan approached. Not because he was a hero, because the interface had reacted to the metal in her hands. The gold frame flashed. Ethan saw the lines of text even before he got close enough. A locket. 750 fine gold, silver inlay, age 40. Broken. The fastening loop is torn off. The center stone is missing. An engraving on the inside. Worn away but restorable. hidden property. Worn daily for over 30 years, the metal has absorbed the owner's imprint. Ethan stopped 2 steps away. The girl raised her head. Her eyes were red. Her face was pale. Her features were delicate. She looked at him with fear, then with irritation, then with indifference. 3 emotions in a second, a trained reaction. Ethan said he saw a broken item she was holding. He said he could fix it. The girl clutched the locket tighter. She asked who he was. Ethan replied that he was a blacksmith. The girl almost smiled. She said she'd already been to blacksmiths, the best in town. They all refused. They said the work was too delicate. They said gold of that age couldn't be soldered without the risk of destroying it. Ethan held out his hand. He said he wanted to take a look. The girl hesitated. Then she slowly placed the locket in his palm. The interface unfolded completely, and Ethan saw its history. A woman had worn the locket, every day, for over 30 years. She had touched it with her right hand, always in the same spot, on the left side of the clasp. There, the gold was 0.02 millimeters thinner, worn away by endless touches. The engraving inside was visible through the interface. A name, a date, and words. Ethan didn't say them aloud. He looked up at the girl. She was waiting. He said he could fix it. He'd restore the clasp. He'd replace the stone. He'd reinforce the engraving. But most importantly, he'd preserve what other goldsmiths couldn't see. The imprint. The warmth of the hands that had worn it for 30 years. The girl looked at him. For a long time. Then she asked when it would be ready. Ethan said tomorrow evening. She nodded and named the meeting place. The bench on the corner of the market square. Ethan asked her name. She hesitated. Then she said her name was Celeste. Just Celeste. Ethan nodded. He didn't know that standing before him was the kingdom's 3rd princess, the king's daughter, the heiress of the house of Valenvar. He saw only a girl with a dead mother and a broken locket, and that was enough. Ethan had been working on the medallion all night. Borch was snoring in the corner. The horns smoldered. A single oil lamp provided the light. Ethan held the medallion in his hands and looked at it through the interface. The gold was old, soft. Over the years, its crystalline structure had changed. The metal grains had grown. They had become larger. This made the gold brittle. Any blacksmith who tried to solder it would have broken the medallion completely. But Ethan wasn't going to solder it. He was going to do something no blacksmith in this world had ever done. Cold pressure welding. In his world, this technique was used to join gold contacts in microelectronics. 2 perfectly pure pieces of gold, pressed together with sufficient force, fuse without heating. The atoms on the surface cannot distinguish where one piece ends and the other begins. They simply integrate into a common lattice. This requires 2 things: absolute surface purity and precise pressure. Ethan cleaned the fracture site. He removed the oxides. He cleared away the contaminants. He worked with the tip of a fine file, guided by the precision provided by the interface. Every movement was calibrated. Every micron counted. Then, he aligned the fragments of the hinge. He clamped them in a small vise he found at the bottom of the toolbox. He slowly tightened it. The interface displayed the pressure. 3 kilograms? 5? 7? At 9 kilograms, the gold surfaces began to fuse. Ethan maintained the pressure for 20 minutes. Then he loosened the vise. The clasp held. No seam, no solder, no trace of repair, as if it had never broken. The stone was more complicated. The original stone had been lost. The interface showed that it was a blue topaz, a teardrop cut, 4 by 6 millimeters. Ethan didn't have any topaz, but he had something else. Last week, one of his clients had paid him with a small bag of river stones. He said they weren't worth anything, but might come in handy as sinkers. Ethan scanned them then and set 3 aside, because the interface showed that one of them contained quartz with iron impurities. With the right treatment, the stone would take on a blue hue similar to topaz. Not identical, but close. Ethan shaped the stone into the desired form with a file. It took about 3 hours. His hands ached. His eyes watered from the strain. But the interface kept him focused, showing him the angles, the facets, and the proportions. By dawn, the stone was ready. Ethan set it into the mount, adjusted the prongs, and closed the locket. He opened it. Closed it again. The mechanism worked. The clasp held, the stone sat securely. The engraving inside was clearer than before the repair. Ethan deepened it with the same file. He carved the lines a fraction of a millimeter deeper. The letters stood out like new. He placed the locket on the workbench and looked at it. An ordinary object. A gold locket with a blue stone. But the interface revealed something else. An imprint. 30 years of daily wear had been imprinted into the metal, and Ethan hadn't touched that layer. Any other blacksmith would have removed it while polishing, would have smoothed out the micro-scratches, would have smoothed out the thin spot on the clasp, would have made the locket look brand new. Ethan left it all as it was, the scratches, the scuffs, the thin spot where his fingers touched it every day. It wasn't just an object, it was a life. He wrapped the locket in a clean cloth and tucked it into his shirt front. He was supposed to meet Celeste that evening, but before then, he had to resolve the issue with Derek. He had 1 day left. Tomorrow morning, the inspector would come for an answer. And if Ethan didn't come up with a solution, the smithy would close. Hyo-jin arrived around noon. She came every day, sometimes with orders from acquaintances, sometimes just to stop by. Today she came with news. Word on the street was that the Hammer Guild was planning a show of force. They'd shut down several illegal workshops. They'd demonstrate their power. The rusty nail was first on the list. Ethan nodded. He'd expected this. Hyo-jin asked if he had a plan. Ethan said he had half a plan. The other half depended on what happened that evening. Hyo-jin wanted to ask what he meant, but Ethan had already gone back to work. No one had canceled the day's orders. 5 knives, 2 axes, 1 arrowhead. Small stuff, routine. But every customer is a coin, and every coin is another day of life for the forge. That evening, Ethan washed up. He put on a clean shirt, his only one. He grabbed his locket and headed to the market square. Celeste was waiting by the stall, the same hooded cloak, but she stood differently. Yesterday, she was broken. Today, she was whole. Her back was straight, her chin slightly raised. A habit. A regal bearing you can't hide. Ethan held out the locket. Celeste took it, opened it, saw the stone, closed it, opened it again. She ran her finger along the clasp and froze. Ethan watched. He knew what she would feel. The worn spot beneath her finger. 30 years of touches imprinted on the metal. Her mother had touched the locket right there, every day, and now her daughter had placed her finger in the exact same spot. Celeste looked up at him. There was something in her eyes that Ethan had seen before, in Garen, in Hyo-jin, that moment when a person gets back a part of themselves they thought was lost forever. She asked how he'd done it, how he'd preserved it. Any blacksmith would have polished it to a shine, but he'd left it as it was. Ethan replied that the locket didn't belong to him, nor to the blacksmith. It belonged to the one who had worn it. His job wasn't to make the object beautiful. His job was to keep it authentic. Celeste was silent for a long time. Then she took out her purse. Ethan saw gold coins inside, lots of them, more than he'd earned in all 3 weeks. He named his price. 5 silver coins, the cost of materials. Celeste looked at him as if he'd said something silly. She placed 10 gold coins on the shop counter. Ethan opened his mouth to object. Celeste said this wasn't payment for the work. It was a thank you for seeing her mother in that piece of metal. Ethan wanted to refuse, but he stopped himself. 10 gold pieces. Derek's fine was 20, half the amount. It was a chance. He took the money. Then he looked at Celeste and did something he hadn't planned. He told her. Not everything. Not about the interface. Not about his world. He told her that the Hammer Guild wanted to shut down his forge, that he had 3 days, that an inspector would arrive tomorrow morning. He didn't ask for help. He just told her. Because in the 3 weeks he'd been in this world, he'd realized one thing. Secrets make you lonely, and a lonely blacksmith is a dead blacksmith. Celeste listened. Her expression didn't change. Composure. A habit of hiding her emotions behind a polite mask. But Ethan noticed how her fingers tightened around the locket. She asked the inspector's name. Ethan said it was Derek Ferrone. Celeste tilted her head slightly, as if the name meant something to her. Then she said she had to go. She asked him not to do anything until morning. She said the inspector would come, but he might leave empty-handed. Ethan didn't understand what she meant, but he nodded. Trust is a strange thing. He'd known this girl for less than a day, but she was holding her dead mother's locket in her hands and crying on the street. People who cry without hiding their tears usually don't lie. Ethan returned to the forge. Borsch was sitting by the furnace, sober. That was unusual. The second time that week. Borsch said that Derek had come to see him while Ethan was away. In person, without any apprentices. He said that if Borsch kicked the boy out himself, the fine would be cut in half. Borsch remained silent. Then he said he hadn't kicked him out. Ethan asked why. Borsch didn't answer for a long time. Then he said that the orphaned boy he'd taken in 3 years ago didn't know how to do anything. His hands shook. He held a file like a spoon. Borsch thought he'd raised a useless freeloader. But it turned out he'd raised a master. A lousy one, a strange one, an incomprehensible one, but a master nonetheless. And he doesn't know what to do about it. But he won't kick him out. Ethan looked at Borch, at the burly drunkard with a crimson face and hands that once dreamed of forging, but now only poured cheap beer. And for the first time, he felt something other than caution toward this man. The night passed quietly. In the morning, Ethan got up before dawn. He stoked the forge. He prepared his tools. He waited. Derek arrived around 9, alone, without any apprentices. His face was pale. His eyes darted about. He walked into the smithy and said that a mistake had been made, that the inspection had been premature, that the guild had decided to grant the Rusty Nail Smithy a temporary license for minor repairs, valid for 6 months. The fine had been rescinded. Borch opened his mouth. Ethan remained silent. Derek placed a scroll bearing the guild seal on the workbench. He turned and left, quickly, as if he were being chased. Borch grabbed the scroll. He unrolled it. The seal was genuine. The signature was genuine. The license was genuine. Borch looked at Ethan. He asked what had happened. Ethan shrugged and replied that he had no idea. He was lying. He knew that Celesta had done something. He didn't know exactly what. But he knew that a girl who pays 10 gold pieces to have a medallion repaired and knows the surname Ferrone isn't just some girl in a plain cloak. That evening, he went to the shop on the market square. Celeste was there, standing against the wall, the medallion around her neck. Ethan approached. He thanked her. She said she hadn't done anything. She'd simply asked the right person to ask the right question of the right person. Ethan asked who she was. Celeste smiled, for the first time in his presence. A subtle smile, controlled, but genuine. She said she was his client, a regular one. She had other items that needed repairing, lots of things, and she wants only him to fix them. Ethan realized that haggling was out of the question. He nodded. Celeste pulled another bundle from under her cloak. She unwrapped it. Inside was a box, silver, covered in patina, with a broken lock. She said this belonged to her mother, too, that her mother had kept her father's letters in it when he went off to war. The lock broke a year ago, and no one can open it without damaging the hinges. Ethan took the box. The interface lit up. 925 sterling silver, lock mechanism, spring-loaded. The mainspring is broken. Repair is possible with 0.3-mm gauge steel wire. Ethan said he'd have it fixed by tomorrow morning. Celeste nodded and left. Ethan returned to the smithy with the box and 10 gold pieces in his pocket. Borsch was drinking by the forge, celebrating his license, but he drank slowly, carefully, with a certain dignity that Ethan hadn't noticed before. Ethan sat down at the workbench. The princess's box lay before him. In the corner, hidden under rags, lay the bones of the first beast. Gold in his pocket. A plan in his head. 3 weeks in this world. 3 weeks in a foreign body. And he'd already restored the veteran's memory. Reshaped the swordswoman's fate. Found meaning for the huntress. Returned the princess's mother to her. Obtained a license from the guild that had wanted to destroy him. And discovered that the monsters devouring the kingdom were born not of nature, but of someone's crime. Ethan picked up the file. A familiar motion. The familiar sound of steel against steel. He smiled. In his past life, he had recycled trash in a lab. In this one, he was turning trash into miracles. The only difference was the scale. Ethan repaired Celesta's box in a single night. He made the spring for the lock out of steel wire he pulled from an old nail. The interface showed that the nail contained 0.7% carbon, perfect for a spring. Ethan heated the wire until it turned cherry red. He wound it around a thin rod. He tempowered it in oil. He annealed it at 300 degrees. The spring turned out to be springy and precise. He inserted it into the lock mechanism. He adjusted it. The box opened with a soft click. Inside lay letters, yellowed paper, faded ink. Ethan didn't read them. He closed the box. The lock worked like new. In the morning, he took the box to Celeste. She was waiting at the same bench. She took it, opened it, closed it, opened it again. Her fingers glided over the letters, but she didn't read them either. Not here. Not with him around. She thanked him. She placed 5 gold pieces on the counter. Ethan took 3. He said 5 was too much. Celeste didn't argue. Then she said she had a proposal. Not a request, a proposal. The royal court had announced a weapons drive for the army. The rusty waves were drawing closer with each passing week. The soldiers needed blades. Lots of blades. The Hammer Guild couldn't keep up. Their smiths demanded dragon steel and mithril, which were in short supply. Celeste said she could add the rusty nail to the list of suppliers for the lower ranks of the army. Ordinary infantry swords. Nothing legendary, but a steady order. 20 blades a month, at a fixed price. 3 silver pieces each. Ethan did the math in his head. 60 silver pieces a month. That was more than all his current revenue. But 20 blades? He couldn't forge 20 blades a month. Not by himself, nor with Hyojin's help. He needed a blacksmith, a real one. He told Celeste he'd take the job. She nodded and left. This time, without looking back. Ethan returned to the smithy and told Borsch. The old man stared at him, then at the license hanging on the wall, then back at Ethan. He asked where he'd gotten such connections. Ethan replied that he'd repaired a medallion for a girl. Borsch shook his head. He said that in 30 years of work, he'd never once received a government contract, and this kid had gotten one in 3 weeks, thanks to a medallion. Borsch wasn't angry. He laughed, quietly, bitterly, but without malice. Then he said he'd help however he could. His hands were weak, and his eyes weren't what they used to be, but he knew where to find blacksmiths. Real ones. The ones who'd been left without work when the guild cracked down on licenses. Borsch went to the market and returned by evening with a man. The blacksmith's name was Tobin, 42 years old, a former Third Circle master of the Hammer Guild, stripped of his title 5 years ago for refusing to sign off on a shipment of swords he considered defective. The guild never forgave him. Tobin had been working as a longshoreman at the river docks. His hands were like a bear's, broad palms, fingers as thick as a hammer handle, old burns from the forge on his knuckles. Tobin walked into the smithy and looked around. He grimaced. He looked at the forge. He grimaced even more. He looked at the anvil. He sighed. Then he looked at Ethan, a boy half his age. He asked if it was true that Ethan fixed things that master craftsmen couldn't. Ethan didn't answer with words. He took one of the knives he'd made off the wall, a simple kitchen knife made of shoddy iron, and placed it in front of Tobin. Tobin picked it up. He turned it over in his hands. He ran his fingernail along the edge. He looked at the way the light refracted off the blade. He frowned. He tried to bend it. It wouldn't bend. He tried harder. The blade sprang back. Tobin put the knife down. He said it was impossible, that you couldn't get a blade like that from iron like this, that the metal structure wouldn't allow it. Ethan said it was possible, if you knew how. Tobin asked how he knew. Ethan replied that he could see it. Tobin didn't understand. Ethan offered to demonstrate. He took a piece of iron from Borsch's box, the worst piece, the rustiest, the most useless. He activated the interface. Golden lines flashed before his eyes. Iron with a high sulfur content, 0.08%. Brittle, fragile, but traces of manganese, 0.3%. Manganese neutralizes the sulfur. It forms manganese sulfide, which doesn't harm the steel. If heated to 1,100 degrees and held for an hour, then reforged, the sulfur will be carried away into the slag along with the manganese. What remains is pure iron with an addition of manganese, and manganese steel means strength and wear resistance. Ethan explained this to Tobin, not in technical terms, but in terms a blacksmith could understand. He said it needed to be heated until it was white hot and held there until the metal stopped sparking. Then hammer it, for a long time, evenly, to drive out the impurities, then quench it in oil, not in water. Tobin listened. His expression changed. First skepticism, then interest, then something like hunger. Tobin hadn't forged in 5 years. For 5 years, his hands had lifted boxes instead of a hammer. He stood up, took off his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, walked over to the forge. Ethan nodded to Borja, who began pumping the bellows. The forge roared to life. Tobin placed a piece of iron into the fire. He waited. Ethan stood nearby and spoke. A little longer, 1 more minute. Now, take it out. Tobin pulled out the red-hot metal and struck it, his first blow in 5 years. The anvil rang out. Tobin struck again, and again, a rhythm, heavy, precise, masterful. His hands remembered. Ethan guided him. Turn it, this way, harder. Now gentler. Pull the edge back. Trim it. They worked for 2 hours. Borsch pumped the bellows. Hyojin came in, drawn by the noise, and stood in the doorway. She watched. By the end of the 2nd hour, a strip of metal lay on the anvil, smooth, solid, with the characteristic bluish sheen of manganese steel. Tobin picked it up. He bent it. The strip sprang back. He tried to snap it. The metal held. Tobin laid the strip back down. He looked at his hands, then at Ethan. He said 2 words. He agreed. Ethan held out his hand. Tobin shook it. The blacksmith's palm completely covered Ethan's. They agreed on the terms. Tobin would get a third of the profits. Tools and materials would be provided by the forge. He'd live in the annex behind the forge. Bork didn't object. He understood that something bigger than his little world was happening, and for the first time, he didn't try to take it for himself. For the first 3 days, Tobin and Ethan got used to working together. Tobin was used to working alone. It felt strange to take orders from a kid. On the second day, he struck the wrong spot and the workpiece cracked. Tobin cursed and threw the hammer on the floor. He said he couldn't forge under someone else's command, that his hands knew instinctively where to strike. Ethan said nothing. He waited for Tobin to cool down. Then he picked up the cracked workpiece. He examined it through the interface. He saw the point of stress concentration. He explained to Tobin what had happened. The blow had landed 3 millimeters to the left of where it should have. The metal was still too hot in that spot. Hot metal is softer. The blow pushed it in deeper than the surrounding areas. A difference in thickness had arisen. That difference created a point of stress. On the next strike, the crack started right there. Tobin listened. He'd been forging for 30 years. But no one had ever explained to him why metal breaks, just that it breaks. The guildmasters taught him to memorize, not to understand. Ethan taught him to understand. Tobin raised his hammer. He said he'd try again. This time he listened to every word. By the end of their first week working together, they had forged 8 swords. Simple ones. Infantry swords, straight, without ornamentation. But each one was better than what the Hammer Guild produced for the lower ranks. The interface confirmed it. Edge hardness, 56 units. Core toughness, within tolerance. Expected service life under intense combat, 400 strikes. The guild's infantry swords lasted 200. Ethan noticed something else. The swords that Tobin forged under his guidance began to glow faintly at the moment of tempering. A golden glow, barely noticeable. Tobin didn't see it. Borch didn't see it. Hyojin didn't see it. But Ethan did. The interface alerted him. The higher the quality of the item, the brighter the magical trace. 8 simple swords gave off a faint glow, almost invisible. But if he started making something serious, the bones of the first beast lay in the corner, waiting. Ethan knew that when he put them to work, the glow would be so intense that anyone who knew how to look would see it, and then the hunt would begin. He set the bones aside. It was too early. First, he needed to establish a foothold, build up his power, create a stockpile. By the end of the month, Rusty Nail had completed its first government contract, 20 swords. Celesta accepted them in person. She came with an officer of the Royal Guard. The officer inspected every blade. He bent them. He struck them against the anvil. He chopped at a piece of wood. He looked at Ethan in surprise. He signed the acceptance form. 60 silver coins landed on the workbench. Ethan divided them up. 20 for Tobin, 10 for Bork for rent and furs, 5 for Hyojin for helping with the hammering. The rest went into the communal fund. Bork counted his share 3 times. He'd never received 10 silver coins in a month. Never. In 30 years. He looked at Ethan and said that the kid had turned his dump into a workshop. Ethan replied that the dump had been a workshop from the very beginning. It's just that no one had looked at it the right way. Tobin grinned. For the first time in a week. Hyojin snorted. Bork poured himself a beer, but just 1 mug, not 3. Miriam arrived that evening, with a new bag, heavier than the last one. Inside were claws, black, curved, as long as a palm. The interface showed a keratin mineral composite. Strength exceeds hardened steel. Heat resistance up to 1,400 degrees. Compatibility with the first beast's bone. Perfect. Ethan paid her everything he could. Miriam asked why he needed so much material. Ethan said he didn't know yet, but he would find out. Miriam nodded. She didn't ask unnecessary questions. She just brought it and left. But each time, she left a little more slowly. The second month began with a misfortune. Not a big one, a small one. But small misfortunes are often worse. Bork started drinking. For real. Not just a mug in the evening, but a bottle first thing in the morning. The reason was simple. Tobin. Bork had seen a true master at work in his smithy. He'd seen Tobin's hammer sing on the anvil. He'd seen the metal obeying someone else's hands. And every blow from Tobin reminded Bork that he himself was no master. Never had been. Never would be. For 3 days, Bork drank and didn't leave the outbuilding. On the 4th day, Ethan came in to see him. Bork was lying on the floor. Empty bottles lay all around him. His eyes were red. He looked at Ethan and told him to get out. He didn't need pity from a kid who, in just a month, had become what Bork had dreamed of being his whole life. Ethan sat down beside him, silently. Then he pulled a horseshoe out of his pocket, one of the 6 nickel ones he'd found in the box during his first week. He placed it in front of Bork. He said that this horseshoe was worth more than all the merchandise on the counter at the Hammer Guild. Bork stared at the rusty piece of iron. He asked Ethan if he'd lost his mind. Ethan replied that this horseshoe contained nickel, a rare metal. Bork didn't know what nickel was. Ethan explained it more simply. He said that the metal in this horseshoe makes the steel rust-proof. Completely. Never. Bork propped himself up on his elbow. His eyes cleared slightly. Ethan continued. He said he'd found these horseshoes in Borch's box, the one Bork had been collecting for 30 years. For 30 years, Bork had been gathering scrap iron, sorted it, stored it. Unable to forge, he did the only thing he could. He hoarded the material. And in that chaos of random scraps and old nails lay 6 horseshoes worth a fortune. Bork didn't know. No one would have known. But Bork kept them. Didn't throw them away. Didn't sell them for a penny. Kept them. Ethan said that Bork had a talent. Not for forging, for finding and storing things. That he didn't need to be a master at the anvil. He needed to be a master at the crate. To search. To select. To stockpile. Ethan offered him a new role. Not the owner of the forge. Not an apprentice. A materials manager. Bork would go to markets and junkyards. He would buy scrap metal, and Ethan would tell him what to look for, what signs to watch for, what color the rust should be, how much it should weigh, what sound it makes when struck. Borsch listened. He didn't cry. Men like Borsch don't cry. But he sat down. He straightened up. He ran his hand over his face and nodded. From that day on, Borsch didn't drink. Or rather, he did drink, but just a mug in the evening, not a bottle first thing in the morning. Every morning he would head to the market, to the junkyards, to the scrap dealers. He'd return with sacks that he'd sort through together with Ethan. Ethan would scan every piece, select the valuable ones. He'd explain to Borsch why they were choosing this particular item. Borsch took it all in. Within a week, he'd learned to tell high-carbon iron from regular iron just by looking at it. After 2 weeks, he could identify steel with chromium alloying by its characteristic hue at the fracture. He didn't know the terms Ethan used for these things, but he could see the difference. Meanwhile, the forge was in full swing. Tobin was forging. Ethan was directing. Hyojin helped with the heavy lifting when Tobin needed an extra pair of hands. Orders were coming in. Military ones. 20 swords a month. Small private orders. Knives, axes, spears, repairs. Revenue was growing. Ethan set aside every extra coin. He needed a specific sum. He was going to buy the blacksmith shop from Borch. Not take it by force, not survive on it. Buy it honestly, with paperwork, with registration at City Hall, so that the rusty nail would become his, officially. Borch himself made the offer at the end of the 2nd month. He came in the evening, sober, with a piece of paper. He said he was selling the smithy to Ethan for 1 silver coin, a symbolic price. Ethan refused. He said he'd pay the full price, 30 gold coins, the market price for a space in the craftsmen's quarter. Borch looked at him as if he were crazy. He said the smithy wasn't worth even 10. Ethan replied that it was, because this was where he had become who he was, and that came at a price. They haggled for an hour, settled on 20. Ethan paid 5 up front, the rest in installments. Borch signed the papers. Ethan took them to City Hall, paid the fee. He received a sealed scroll. The Rusty Nail Smithy. Owner, Ethan. No last name, no family. An orphan. This was the first time in Kervin's history that a person of no lineage had owned a craft workshop within the city walls. The Hammer Guild found out 2 days later. This time, it wasn't Derek who came. A man in a black cloak arrived. No guild insignia, no name. He entered at night. Ethan was awake. He was working on a lock for a box brought in by a new customer. The man in black sat down across from him. He placed a small bag on the workbench. Leather. Heavy. He untied it. Inside were gold coins. Lots of them. Ethan estimated by eye. 100 gold coins. Maybe more. The man said his master wanted to buy Ethan's work. Everything. Anything. At whatever price Ethan named. No questions asked, no limits. The only condition, no one was to know who the buyer was. Ethan asked who the master was. The man smiled. He said that wasn't part of the deal. Ethan looked at the gold. 100 coins. That was more than he'd earn in a year, maybe 2. With that money, he could buy a new forge, real furs, the tools he'd been dreaming of. He could start working with the bones of the first beast. But Ethan didn't like dark bags or nameless buyers. He said he'd think about it. The man nodded. He left the little bag on the table. He said he'd return in 3 days for an answer, and he left as quietly as he'd come. Ethan didn't touch the gold. He covered the bag with a rag and went to sleep. In the morning, he told Hyojin about it. She grew wary. She said she knew people like that, middlemen, shadows. They work for those who don't want to draw attention to themselves. Sometimes they're just wealthy collectors. Sometimes they're people you should stay far away from. Ethan asked her to find out more. Hyojin nodded and left. She returned 2 days later, her face somber. She said the middleman's name was Wayne. He's known in certain circles. He buys up unusual items for someone in the East. In the East? Where the rust waves come from. Ethan felt something tighten inside him. The East. The cult of rust. He'd heard about them from soldiers who came to have their weapons repaired. Fanatics who believe the rust waves are the purification of the world. That these creatures are God's punishment for human pride. If Wayne works for them, then the gold on the workbench isn't payment. It's bait. When Wayne returned 3 days later, Ethan was ready. He returned the pouch untouched. He said he doesn't work with anonymous clients. Wayne wasn't surprised. He didn't get angry. He just took the gold. He paused at the threshold. He glanced back at Ethan over his shoulder. He said his master was patient, and that the offer still stood. Always. Then he left. Hyojin stood around the corner of the smithy, swords in hand, just in case the conversation didn't go as planned. It wasn't needed. Not yet. The 3rd month brought Yoon. Ethan had been looking for an alchemist for 2 weeks. He asked around at the market. He asked his customers. He asked Borja. Everyone said the same thing. Alchemists work at the Royal Academy. There are no private ones. Well, there are some, but they brew hangover potions and sell them under the table. There were no serious specialists among them. Ethan wouldn't have it. He didn't need an academic alchemist in a robe with a diploma. He needed someone who knew how to isolate substances from raw materials, to extract, to purify, to concentrate. In his world, that was called a chemical engineer. Here, it was called a heretic. Miriam found Yuna. She came by one evening and said she knew a woman, an alchemist. She lived in the basement of a pharmacy in the lower city. She'd been expelled from the academy for researching low alchemy, extracting valuable substances from waste. Miriam said she'd gone to her for an ointment for insect bites 3 years ago. The ointment worked, better than the one from the academy. Ethan went to see her the next day. The pharmacy's basement was worse than Borja's blacksmith shop. Low ceiling, damp walls, the smell of sulfur and something sour. Vials on the shelves. Hundreds of vials. With liquids of every color. Crucibles on the table. Retorts. Glass tubes. Everything was homemade. Everything was crooked. But it worked. Yuna was sitting at the table. 24 years old. Thin. Dark hair pulled back into a bun. Rock crystal glasses on her nose. Her eyes were intelligent and fierce. She looked at Ethan and asked what he needed. A potion for acne or for impotence. Ethan pulled a rusty shard out of his pocket. That very one, with a 0.3% osmium content. He found it at a landfill a week ago. He'd scanned it with the interface. Osmium, an extremely rare metal. On Earth, it was more valuable than gold. Here, no one knew about it, because no one knew how to extract it. Ethan placed the scrap in front of Yuna and asked if she could extract the osmium from it. Yuna stared at him, then at the scrap. Then she took off her glasses, wiped them, put them back on, looked again, asked how he knew there was osmium in it. Ethan said he could see it. Yuna laughed, sharply, briefly, like a bark. Then she stopped. She looked at Ethan seriously. She asked how he even knew the word osmium. In this world, osmium was known only at the academy, and only in theory. No one had ever seen it in its pure form. No one knew how to extract it. Yuna had been expelled precisely because she'd tried. Her dissertation was on methods for extracting rare elements from ore. The academy had declared her work heresy. They said that low alchemy was a desecration of the high art, that a true alchemist creates, not digs around in the dirt. Yuna lost everything, her title, her laboratory, her reputation. 5 years of her life branded as heresy. Ethan sat down across from her. He looked her in the eyes and said he could show her where osmium hides, in every piece of metal, in every stone, in every handful of earth, that he sees the composition of things, any things, and that he needed someone who could turn that knowledge into a pure product. Yuna was silent for a long time. Then she stood up. She walked over to the shelf. She took out a vial of murky liquid. She dripped some onto a shard. The liquid hissed. A reaction began. A minute later, a tiny speck appeared on the surface of the iron. Silvery blue. with a metallic sheen. Yuna looked at the spot, then at Ethan. Her eyes had changed. Not angry, not tired, alive. She said one word. "When?" Ethan replied, "Now!" Yuna took off her apron, put on another one, a clean one. Ethan brought 3 more fragments with rare impurities from the forge. They worked all night. Yuna knew chemistry, not from textbooks, but from experience. For 5 years in the basement, she'd experimented alone, without equipment, without money, without support. She'd developed methods not found in academic books. Acid etching, selective precipitation, distillation of metal vapors through glass tubes. Ethan gave her the data: composition, temperatures, concentrations. Yuna translated the data into action. By morning, they had a crucible of osmium, pure, 3 grams, a tiny bead of silvery blue metal at the bottom of a clay cup. Yuna held the cup in her hands and couldn't take her eyes off it. 5 years. For 5 years she tried to do this on her own, and she hadn't been able to, because she didn't know where to look. But the boy from the dirty smithy came along and showed her. She asked his name. Ethan introduced himself. Yuna took off her glasses. She wiped them. For no reason. She just needed something to keep her hands busy. Then she said she wanted to work with him. All the time. Ethan nodded. They discussed the terms. Yuna would move into the annex next to the blacksmith shop. She'd receive a quarter of the profits from the sale of the extracted elements. She'd have access to all the materials. Ethan would provide the raw materials and data. Yuna would handle the process. A week later, the pharmacy's basement was empty. Yuna moved her lab into the annex next to the smithy. Tobin helped haul the heavy crucibles. Borch set aside a corner for storing reagents. Hyojin eyed the test tubes suspiciously but said nothing. The rusty nail was changing. From a dirty blacksmith shop in the back alleys, it was turning into something more. A blacksmith's workshop, an alchemical laboratory, a warehouse for rare materials. Ethan stood in the middle of the courtyard and looked at his team. Tobin was sharpening a blade at the anvil. Yuna was boiling something in a retort. Borch was sorting through a bag of scrap metal from the morning market. Hyojin was sharpening her pair of swords. Miriam was supposed to arrive by evening with a new batch of bones. 5 people. 3 months. Starting from nothing. Ethan thought back to his lab in Pittsburgh. 12 people. Millions of dollars worth of equipment. A grant from the Department of Energy. And in 3 years, they'd accomplished less than Ethan had in 3 months in a medieval smithy. The difference was simple. Back there, he'd worked for the system. Here, the system worked for him. Because here, there was no system yet. He was building it himself. That evening, Celeste came by, with a new order. But this time, it wasn't a repair. She brought a letter, sealed, with the royal seal. She placed it on the workbanks. She said it was an invitation. In 3 months, the Grand Masters Tournament, the annual blacksmiths competition, held under the king's patronage. Everyone participates. The Hammer Guild, independent masters, foreign blacksmiths. The winner receives the title of Royal Master and the right to work without a guild license, forever. Celeste said she had entered Ethan's name on the list of participants, without his knowledge, because she knew he would refuse if she asked. Ethan looked at the letter, then at Celeste. She stood upright, her chin slightly raised, her mother's locket around her neck. She hadn't asked. She hadn't tried to persuade him. She'd simply presented him with a fait accompli. Ethan took the letter. He broke the seal. He read it. The Grand Masters Tournament, in 3 months, at the Royal Arena, presided over by the Supreme Master of the Hammer Guild, Octavian Ferrone. Ethan put the letter back. He looked at the bones of the first beast in the corner. At Yunin with her osmium crucible. At Tobin by the anvil. At Hyojin with her swords. At Borja with his sack of scrap metal. 3 months. That would be enough. The first assassination attempt took place a week after Ethan received his invitation to the tournament. It was nighttime. The blacksmith's shop was closed. Tobin was asleep in the outbuilding. Yuna was working by candlelight on her latest experiment. Borch had gone home. Hyojin was spending the night with friends in the adventurer's quarter. Ethan is alone. He lies on his straw mat, staring at the ceiling. He isn't sleeping. He's thinking about the tournament, about what he'll show, about what he'll do. The interface flickers at the edge of his consciousness, always on, always ready. And it is precisely the interface that saves him. The blacksmith's door creaks quietly. Ethan freezes. He doesn't move. A figure slips through the crack, dark, silent, holding something in its hand. The interface reacts to the metal. A golden frame outlines the object in the stranger's hand. A knife. Low-quality steel. The blade is 15 centimeters long. No guard. The handle is wrapped in a rag so it won't slip in a sweaty hand. The edge is blunt. Only the tip is sharpened for a stabbing strike. This isn't an assassin. An assassin would have a better weapon. This is a mercenary. A cheap one. The figure moves toward Ethan's mat. 2 steps. 3. Ethan lies motionless. His heart is pounding. The boy's body wants to scream, but the engineer's mind works coldly. Ethan waits. The figure bends down. Swings. Ethan rolls out of the way. The knife strikes the straw. Ethan grabs the first thing that comes to hand. A poker for the stove. Heavy. Made of iron. He swings blindly. Hits the attacker's arm. The attacker cries out. Drops the knife. Ethan strikes again. In the knee. The figure falls. Tobin bursts out of the outbuilding. Shirtless. Holding a hammer. The blacksmith's hammer weighs 5 kilograms. Tobin holds it with one hand. The attacker sees Tobin. Sees the hammer. Decides his life is more important. He dashes for the door. Tobin doesn't chase him. He stands there, covering Ethan. Yuna peeks around the corner with a vial in her hand, ready to splash it. Acid, or something worse. The attacker vanishes into the darkness. Ethan sits on the floor. His hands are shaking. The poker slips from his fingers. The adrenaline wears off. The boy's body reacts. Nausea, shivering, weakness. Tobin lights the lamp. He surveys the forge. He finds a knife on the floor, picks it up, turns it over in his hands. Says it's junk, cheap work. They spent the bare minimum on the hitman. Ethan stands up, takes the knife, activates the interface. Steel, low quality, roughly forged. But on the handle, under a rag, is a brand. Small, indented. The letter F inside a circle. Pharaon. This isn't just some mercenary off the street. He was sent by the guild, or someone from the guild. The Pharaon brand was stamped on all their products, including the cheapest ones. It was their knife, their order. Ethan showed the brand to Tobin. Tobin turned pale. He sat down on a bench. He rubbed his face with his hands. He said it was Octavian, the Grand Master. He doesn't send assassins personally, but he has people to do his dirty work. Tobin knew that. 5 years ago, when he refused to sign the acceptance form, they'd come for him in the middle of the night too. He'd survived because he was a strong man and a light sleeper. Ethan was neither. In the morning, Ethan told everyone. Tobin, Yuna, and Borch. Hyojin came and was the last to find out. Her reaction was simple. She turned around and walked away. She returned an hour later with her belongings, a small bag, a change of clothes, and a pair of swords. She said she'd be spending the night here, in the forge, on the floor, between the door and Ethan's sleeping mat. Ethan started to object. Hyojin looked at him in a way that silenced his objections. She said he was her master, that he had forged her a weapon she trusted, that no one had ever looked at her, and not just her lineage, before, and that if anyone thought they could come at night with a knife to the man who had given her the swords, that person was wrong. Ethan fell silent. The words stuck in his throat, not because there was nothing to say, because there was too much. Hyojin tossed her bag into the corner. She lay down. She closed her eyes. The conversation was over. From that day on, the forge was never left unguarded. Hyojin spent the night inside. Tobin stayed in the annex with a hammer at the ready. Yuna placed a vial containing something, which Ethan preferred not to ask about, at the entrance to the lab. Borch started carrying an old cutlass with him. Ethan didn't waste time on fear. He spent it preparing for the tournament. 3 months. Now 2.5. He needed to decide exactly what he would forge. The tournament worked simply. Each participant was given the same set of materials. Royal materials. The best. Dragon steel, mithril, bones of the first beasts. All rare. All expensive. The craftsmen forged whatever they wanted. The judges evaluated the work. The best one won. Ethan could win by the rules. He could take the royal materials and make something better out of them than anyone else. The interface allowed it. Tobin could forge it. But Ethan didn't want to win by the rules. He wanted to change the rules. The plan was simple and insane. He wouldn't use the royal materials. He'd push the box aside and forge from trash, from what lay at his feet, from nails and debris and dust, from everything this world considers useless, and he would create something that would silence everyone who believed that mastery comes from blood, not knowledge. He explained the plan to the team. Tobin shook his head. He said it was suicide, that the guild judges, they'd condemn him for disrespecting the materials. Yuna adjusted her glasses and said the idea was brilliant from a chemical standpoint. You can extract valuable elements from any pile of trash if you know how. Borch silently poured himself a beer. 1 mug. Hyojin smirked and said that if anyone could make a sword out of trash, it would be Ethan. Miriam came by that evening. She brought another bag. This time, it wasn't bones or claws. Wool. Coarse. Stiff. With a metallic sheen. Ethan scanned it. The wool of the first beast contained fibers with iron inclusions. A natural metallic composite. With the right processing, the fibers could be woven into steel. They would create a reinforcing mesh inside the blade, like fiberglass and epoxy resin. Strength would increase by 40%. Ethan took the fur in his hands. Soft. Warm. Strange. He asked Miriam where she'd found it. Miriam said in the lair of the slain beast. On the floor. In its den. The beast had been sleeping on its own fur. Other hunters would have burned the den. Miriam gathered the fur. Every tuft. She didn't even know why herself. She just felt she couldn't throw it away. Ethan looked at her. Miriam was standing in the doorway, wet from the rain, tired, with dirty hands and a scrape on her cheek. She'd walked for 3 days from the wastelands, carrying a sack of fur that the whole world considered trash. He told her she was a genius. Miriam turned away, but she didn't leave. She stood in the doorway for another minute. Then she quietly asked if she could spend the night in the blacksmith's shop. The rain was heavy. Ethan nodded. Miriam sat down by the forge. She stretched out her legs. She closed her eyes. 5 minutes later, she was asleep. Hyojin covered her with a blanket, silently, without comment. Ethan sat at the workbench and made a list. What he needed for the tournament. Trash. Anything. The more varied, the better. Debris, nails, chains, glass, clay, wood, bones, fabric, everything. He didn't know yet exactly what would be in the arena. He didn't know what kind of junk he'd find, but he knew what the interface would show him. That there's gold in every handful of dust. That a sword is hidden in every rusty nail. You just need to know and be able to see. Ethan spent the 2 months leading up to the tournament in a mode that on Earth would be called a startup in the run-up to demo day. Every hour was scheduled. Every resource was accounted for. Morning. Tobin is forging a batch of army swords, 20 a month. He couldn't afford to fail this contract. It was his livelihood. It was his reputation. It was his connection to Celesta and the court. Ethan stood by his side, guiding him. Every strike, every heating, every tempering. The quality of the army swords improved with every batch. The first batch withstood 400 strikes. The third, 500. The fourth batch, 550. The Royal Guard officer who took the orders stopped inspecting every blade. He checked 1 out of 5, then 1 out of 10. Trust. Ethan valued it more than gold. Daytime. Yuna is working in the lab. She's extracting trace elements from the raw materials Borch brings in. Osmium, vanadium, molybdenum, tungsten. Tiny specks, fractions of a gram, but each speck is worth its weight in diamonds. Yuna developed a new method, electrolytic deposition. She built a simple electroplating bath out of a clay pot filled with acid and 2 copper plates. She ran a current through it from a homemade battery. Zinc and copper in acid, a voltaic cell. Ethan drew her a diagram. Yuna put it together in a day. When the first deposit of pure metal appeared on the copper plate, Yuna took off her glasses and wiped them 4 times in a row. Then she looked at Ethan and asked where he'd gotten all this from. Ethan replied that he'd read a lot. Yuna didn't believe him, but she didn't press the issue. A silent agreement settled between them. Yuna doesn't ask where Ethan gets his knowledge from. Ethan doesn't ask why Yuna sometimes looks at him as if she's trying to take him apart into his constituent parts, like a retort. Evening. Ethan is working alone. Everyone is asleep. The horn smolders. The lamp is on. He sits at the workbench and practices, not forging, seeing. The interface shows more when Ethan is focused. When he's tired, it shows less. So it's a skill, like a muscle. It can be trained. Ethan picks up object after object, scans, memorizes, analyzes. A scrap, a nail, a stone, a shard of glass, a pottery shard, a splinter. Every object holds a story. Every object holds potential. In 2 months, Ethan has learned to scan 3 times faster. A simple object in 10 seconds. A complex one in a minute. It used to take 30 seconds and 5 minutes. Progress. Ethan was also training something else. His body. The boy was weak. Ethan was weak. But a 19-year-old body responds to training. Hyojin took him under her wing. Every morning before dawn, running around the neighborhood, push-ups, squats, weight training. Hyojin didn't go easy on him. The first week, Ethan threw up after every workout. The second week, he simply collapsed. By the third, he was holding his own. By By the end of the second month, he could lift Tobin's hammer with both hands and swing it 10 times in a row without a break. Not master-level skill, but enough for simple forging. His hands grew stronger, his calluses hardened, his breathing became steadier. Hyojin said he'd never make a fighter, but he'd make a good porter. Ethan smirked. That suited him just fine. Alongside his tournament training, Ethan was conducting an investigation. Quietly, cautiously. He remembered what he'd seen on the broken swords at the Royal Armory. The chemical composition of the corrosion from the rusty waves. Slag waste. Industrial. For centuries, someone had been dumping metallurgical waste in the eastern lands. Ethan asked Borch to bring back not only scrap metal from the market, but also rumors. Borch turned out to be good at this. 30 years in the back alleys of the craftsmen's quarter had taught him to hear what others missed. Borch explained that the Hammer Guild had been sending defective batches to the east for 200 years. Everyone knew this. Flawed alloys, failed smelting runs, slag. Anything unsuitable for sale was hauled to the eastern borders and dumped into the dead ravines. It was cheaper that way than to recycle it. No one thought it was dangerous. Borch discovered something else. 50 years ago, the guild began dumpster more than just slag. They were dumping the results of experiments, failed attempts to create new alloys, unstable mixtures, and metals with magical impurities that behaved unpredictably. All of this ended up in the dead ravines, and 20 years later, the first creatures began to crawl out of the ravines. Ethan gathered facts. He recorded them, not on paper, but in his head. Paper can be found, a mind, not yet. He didn't yet know how he would use this information, but he knew that sooner or later he would have to, because the rusty waves were approaching. Every week, new soldiers arrived with broken weapons. Every week, the corrosion on the swords was a little worse. A little deeper, a little more aggressive. The creatures were evolving, feeding on the very trash that had spawned them. A month before the tournament, Lyra Farone came to Ethan. He didn't know her name. He didn't know who she was. He saw only a girl, young, 17 years old, with a straight back and cold eyes. Her clothes were expensive, practical, calluses on her hands, not from working in the fields, from a hammer. She walked into the blacksmith shop in the afternoon. She looked around. She didn't flinch. She didn't flinch precisely because she was trying with all her might not to flinch. Self-control. Upbringing. She said she'd come to see Master Ethan's work. Tobin tensed. He recognized her. He whispered to Ethan. Lyra Farone, Octavian's granddaughter. The only girl in the Hammer Guild. The best apprentice. Ethan looked at her differently. Farone. The mark on the assassin's knife. Her grandfather sent the assassin. His granddaughter came in person. Different methods. Same last name. Lyra said she wanted to see his method. Not to steal it, to see it. She'd heard that Ethan does the impossible with metal. She wants to understand how. If he's a charlatan, she'll expose him before the tournament. If not, she wants to know. Ethan could have refused. He should have refused. She was the enemy. Her family wanted him dead. But Ethan looked at her hands, at the calluses, at the burn on her left wrist. Fresh, a week old. She was forging, not for show, for real. He asked what she had forged last. Lyra froze. She hadn't expected that question. Then she said it was a long sword, made of dragon steel, for the tournament. Ethan asked her to show it to him. Lyra didn't move. Then she slowly pulled a long bundle from behind her back. She unwrapped it. The blade was beautiful, truly beautiful. Dark steel with a crimson sheen, engravings along the blade. The hilt was wrapped in dragon skin. The work of a master, a true master. Ethan took the blade. The interface lit up. Dragon steel, top grade, 1.2% carbon, 4% chromium, forged at 1050 degrees, tempered in dragon oil, double tempering. The workmanship is flawless. Almost. Ethan found one spot, just one, on the heel, 12 centimeters from the guard. Microstress. Invisible. Imperceptible. It doesn't affect function, but after 340 strikes at that spot, a crack will form. 50 strikes after that, the blade will break. Ethan looked at Lyra. She was standing across from him, waiting. Her back was straight. Her eyes were cold. But deep down, fear. Not of Ethan, of the answer. Ethan told her. Right here. He pointed to the spot. 12 centimeters from the guard. This is where it will break, after 340 strikes. Lyra held her breath. She asked why. Ethan explained. During forging, she'd made one extra strike, just one, right here. The metal was 20 degrees hotter than the adjacent section. The strike drove the grain deeper. It created a micro-porosity. The pore is invisible, but it's there, and it will destroy the blade. Lyra took the sword back. Her hands didn't tremble. Her expression didn't change, but Ethan could tell, by the muscle in her cheek, by her clenched jaw. She knew he was right. Not because she'd checked, because her whole life she'd felt that something was missing from her work. Something always slipped away. The guild masters told her she was the best, that her blades were flawless, but she knew better, and no one could tell her what was wrong. Ethan did. Lyra put the sword away. She stood there in silence. Then she turned and walked away, without saying goodbye, without thanking him. Tobin shook his head. He said that Ethan had just revealed his trump card to his opponent, that Lyra would be his rival at the tournament, that knowing the weakness in her own blade gave her an advantage. Ethan replied that knowledge always gives an advantage, not to him, not to her, to knowledge itself. Tobin didn't understand. Hyojin stood by the door and watched Lyra walk away. She said that this girl would return. Ethan nodded. He thought so too. Lyra returned 3 days later, just as Hyojin had predicted. She arrived at dawn, alone, without an entourage, and without the guild's emblem on her clothes. She wore a plain work jacket with rolled-up sleeves. She stood in the doorway and silently watched Ethan. He was stoking the forge. The coals hadn't caught fire yet. Tobin was asleep. Yuna was clinking test tubes in the lab. Hyojin was sharpening swords by the wall, and at the sight of Lyra, she placed her hand on the hilt. Lyra paid no attention to her. She was looking at Ethan. Then she said she'd checked it. She took her blade, secured it in the vise. She struck the spot he had indicated, exactly 340 times. On the 341st strike, a crack appeared, as thin as a hair, exactly where Ethan had said. She had been forging this sword for half a year, the finest dragon steel, the finest tools, the finest techniques taught by the guild's greatest masters, and a single boy in a dirty smithy saw in a minute what she hadn't seen in half a year. Ethan was silent. He waited. Lyra asked if he would teach her to see. Ethan answered honestly. What he sees cannot be taught. It is his gift, his curse, his eyes. But what he knows can be taught. Why metal breaks, how the grains behave when heated, what happens inside the blade with every blow of the hammer. This isn't magic, it's knowledge, and it belongs to everyone. Lyra stood motionless. Everything she knew was at odds with what she saw. All her life, she'd been told that mastery runs in the blood, that the gift of forging is passed down from father to son, that a bastard cannot be a master because the gods did not grant him the spark. And here before her stood a bastard orphan who understood metal better than all the guild's masters combined. She asked what he planned to do at the tournament. Ethan explained. Not everything, but enough. He said he wouldn't use the royal materials, that he would forge from scrap. Lyra looked at him as if he'd gone mad. She said the judges would destroy him, that Octavian would never allow a bastard to win, especially with such a provocation. Ethan replied that he knew. Lyra was silent for a moment. Then she said that her grandfather wasn't an evil man. He loved metal more than life itself. He mourns every broken blade. He prays for the kingdom's salvation from the rusty waves. But he believes that the order of the world is the order of blood, and that an orphan with a gift is a mistake of the gods that must be corrected. Ethan nodded. He didn't hate Octavian. You can't hate a person for what they believe. You can only show him that the world is broader than his faith. Lyra left. She turned around at the threshold. She said she would face him in the tournament, that she had no choice. She is a Farron, but if he wins fairly, she'll admit it, in front of everyone. Ethan nodded. Lyra disappeared around the corner. Hyojin took her hand off the hilt. She said that this girl was dangerous, not because she was an enemy, but because she could become a friend. And friends from the enemy camp are the most unpredictable. Ethan smirked. Wise words for a swordswoman. Hyojin snorted and went back to sharpening her blade. The last month before the tournament was the hardest. Ethan wasn't forging anything legendary. He was training on scrap. Every day, Borch brought a sack of random junk. Ethan would scan the contents. He'd find valuable alloys. He'd devise a formula. Tobin would forge. Yuna would extract the additives. In a month, they made 12 blades out of junk. Each one better than the last. The last one was made from the contents of a trash can. Rusty nails, a fragment of a door hinge, and a piece of a lead water pipe that Ethan had stripped of its lead to reveal a copper layer inside with a high tin content. Bronze. A fluke. forgotten inside the lead pipe. The blade turned out short, springy, with an edge that sliced through silk in midair. Tobin stopped shaking his head. He no longer considered the plan insane. He saw the results. Celeste arrived a week before the tournament. She brought news. Octavian would personally head the panel of judges. 5 judges. 3 from the guild, 1 from the court, 1 guest master from across the sea. The rules were standard. 3 hours for forging, any object, judged on 5 criteria: quality of material, complexity of technique, beauty of form, functionality, and the final criterion, soul. Abstract, subjective, decisive in the event of a tie. Ethan asked what soul meant. Celeste said it's when you take an object in your hand and feel that it's alive, that it's made not just with skill, but with an understanding of who it's made for. Ethan smiled. Soul. He knew about the soul. Garen knew. Hyojin knew. Everyone who had held his work in their hands knew. Celeste said something else, quietly, seriously. She said that if Ethan won, she would have to reveal the truth, that she was the third princess, that she had been watching over him from the very beginning. It would be a scandal. The court would go wild. The king would demand an explanation. The guild would accuse the crown of conspiring with a commoner. Ethan asked if she was ready. Celeste touched the locket around her neck. Worn. Warm. With that same thin spot on the clasp where her mother's fingers had touched it for 30 years. She said her mother had never been afraid to do what she believed was right, and that the locket reminded her of that every day. She left. Ethan stood in the blacksmith's courtyard. 1 month. Just 1 month. Then everything would change. Or it would all be over. He returned to the workbench. He picked up a scrap of metal. He activated the interface. Golden lines flashed before his eyes, and Ethan began to work. The day of the tournament began with rain. Then the rain stopped and the sun came out. The royal arena stood in the center of Cairvan. A stone amphitheater seating 3,000 spectators. The rows were filled. Aristocrats sat above under the awnings. The common folk were below on stone benches. Guards stood among them. The arena was circular. In the center were 12 blacksmithing stations, a horn, an anvil, a barrel of water, a set of tools, and a chest. At each station stood an identical dark wooden chest bearing the royal seal. Inside were materials. Ethan knew what they were. Dragon steel, mithril, bone dust of the first beast, oil from fiery salamanders. The best this world had to offer. 12 masters. Ethan saw them when he stepped into the arena. 10 men, 1 woman, and him. The youngest, the thinnest, wearing the dirtiest apron. The crowd stirred when his name was announced. Ethan, no last name, the rusty nail forge. Whispers rippled through the ranks. Someone laughed. Someone whistled. In the upper tiers, the aristocrats exchanged glances. A commoner? At the grand tournament? Nonsense. The king sat in the royal box. His advisors were beside him. And Celesta, the third princess, in a simple dress without adornments. She was looking at Ethan. Her face was calm. Her hands were on her knees. Her fingers were clenched so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. On the opposite side of the stands sat Octavian Ferroni, an old man, tall, with white hair down to his shoulders, straight as a blade, gray eyes, harsh. Around his neck hung the Supreme Master's chain, golden links shaped like hammers. He stared at Ethan without blinking. Ethan held his gaze, not out of bravery, out of respect. This old man loved metal. Ethan could see it in his eyes. Love. Real love. Just directed in the wrong place. Lyra stood 3 stations away from Ethan. Her back was straight. Her face was stony. She wasn't looking at the old man. She wasn't looking at Ethan. She was looking at her anvil, at her bellows, at her box of materials. She was getting ready. Herald announced the rules. 3 hours. Forge any object. Judged by 5 judges on 5 criteria. The competition begins when the bell rings. The bell rang. 11 craftsmen opened their boxes. Ethan didn't touch his. He turned toward the edge of the arena. There, behind the railing, stood the arena attendants. All day before the tournament, they'd been preparing the site, sweeping, cleaning, taking out the trash. The trash lay in a pile by the gate. Shards of wood from old benches, rusty nails, scraps of chain from the railing, someone's broken glasses, a shattered clay mug, candle stubs, a bundle of straw. Ethan walked over to the pile. 3,000 spectators fell silent. He crouched down. He activated the interface. Golden lines burst with information. nails, iron, carbon 0.5%, traces of tungsten 0.08%, a chain, steel, manganese 0.4%, chromium 0.1%, the mug, clay with a high aluminum content. When fired, it will produce a refractory crucible. The glasses, copper frames, lenses made of rock quartz, 97% pure copper, 3% tin in the solder, straw, carbon, potassium, silicon. When burned, it will produce ash rich in potash. Potash is a flux. Candles, paraffin. When burned, it will provide carbon for carburizing. Ethan gathered everything. He carried it to his workstation. He laid it out. The arena buzzed. The spectators didn't understand. The masters at the neighboring stations were giving him sidelong glances. One of them laughed out loud. Octavian leaned forward from the stands. His gray eyes narrowed. Ethan began. The first hour. He smashed a mug. He fired the shards in the kiln. He obtained a refractory crucible. He placed nails in the crucible. He melted them down. Yuna had taught him over the course of 2 months how to purify the melt. Ethan threw straw ash into the crucible. Potash drew the sulfur and phosphorus into the slag. The slag floated to the surface. Ethan skimmed it off with a wooden stick. Pure iron mixed with tungsten remained in the crucible. The second hour. He added chain links to the melt. The manganese and chromium from the chains strengthened the alloy. Ethan poured the metal into a mold, narrow and long, the blade of a dagger. He carved the mold out of the wet sand that covered the arena. The casting cooled. Ethan pulled out the blank, rough, uneven, but the interface showed that the alloy was good, better than army swords, no worse than average dragon steel, made from scrap. He began to forge it, by himself, with his own hands. 2 months of training with Hyojin, his hands were ready, not for a masterpiece, for a dagger, short, slender, simple. He struck, steadily, rhythmically. He rotated the blank, drawn it out, shaped the blade. The interface showed every strike, here, like this, with this force. Ethan listened. His hands listened. The third hour, the hilt. Ethan melted down the copper frames of his glasses. He cast a thin sleeve from them. He fitted it onto the blade's tang. He wrapped it with the remains of the chain. The links fit tightly, comfortably. He adjusted each link so that his fingers would rest in the indentations between them. Then hardening, not in water, not in oil, in candle ash, a carbon-rich environment. The blade's surface became saturated with carbon. It grew hard. The core remained ductile. The dagger was springy and held its edge. 10 minutes remained. Ethan stopped. He looked at the dagger. Good, sturdy, functional, but not a masterpiece. A masterpiece isn't about the alloy or the shape. A masterpiece is about the soul. Ethan turned to the audience. He was looking for someone. He didn't know who. He was just looking, and he found her. In the third row, a little girl, about 7 or 8 years old, skinny, in a patched dress. She was clutching something small in her fist, something metallic. The interface reacted. A locket, cheap, brass, bent, on a chain made of iron rings. Ethan walked up to the railing. 3,000 eyes were watching him. He crouched down in front of the girl. He asked what she was holding in her hand. The girl opened her fist. A locket, with scratched-in initials. Ethan activated the interface. Brass, low quality, but on the surface, traces of sweat. A man's. A man had worn the locket, for many years. Scratch marks from fingernails on the back. A habit of fidgeting, nervous. A soldier's. Ethan asked whose it was. The girl said it was her dad's. Her voice was quiet, high-pitched. Ethan asked where her dad was. The girl didn't answer. She didn't cry. Children who've lost their parents in war don't cry in public. They clench whatever's left in their fist and stay silent. Ethan held out his hand. The girl hesitated. Then she placed the locket in his palm. The interface opened fully. History. The locket had been worn for 8 years, every day. The owner was left-handed. A soldier. Killed in action. Rusty waves. 3 months ago. Ethan returned to the station. 5 minutes. He took the locket. He heated it in the furnace. Not too much. Up to 200 degrees. He straightened the bent spot. He smoothed it out. He didn't polish it. He left the scratches. He left the marks. Then he took the dagger, the one he'd spent 3 hours forging from scrap. Nails, chains, broken glasses, and a shattered mug. and he fused the locket into the pommel of the hilt, carefully, so that the initials would be visible, so that the warmth of his hand on the hilt would be transferred to the medallion. Brass and steel, father and daughter, scrap and memory. The bell rang. Time was up. Ethan stood at his workstation. In his hands, a dagger with a brass medallion on the hilt. The judges made their way from station to station in turn. First, they evaluated the craftsman from the Gravelock House. He had forged a battle axe from Mithril. Beautiful, heavy, inlaid with silver. The judges nodded. They took notes. Then they moved on. The second craftsman, the third, the fourth. Each one displayed his work: swords, shields, halberds. One had forged a breastplate from dragon steel. Another had made bracers with bone inlays. Everything was beautiful. Everything was expensive. Everything was flawless by the guild's standards. Lyra was the last to forge before Ethan. She presented a new blade, not the one she'd brought to the forge, a new one. She had reforged it a month after her visit to Ethan. She'd taken his advice to heart. Ethan activated the interface remotely. The blade was better. The stress point was gone. The forging was even. The grain was fine. The tempering was precise. Service life, 800 strikes, twice as much as before. Lyra was a quick learner. The judges approached Ethan last. Octavian rose from the stands and descended into the arena. He wanted to see for himself. He walked slowly, upright, with the Supreme Master's chain across his chest. The spectators fell silent. 3,000 people fell quiet. Octavian stopped in front of Ethan's workstation. He looked at the anvil, at the horn, at the untouched box of royal materials, at the pile of slag and scraps on the floor, at the dagger in the boy's hands. He held out his hand. Ethan placed the dagger in his palm. Octavian took it, turned it over, ran his finger along the edge, pulled it away. Blood, just like back then with Borscht. As always with Ethan's blades, the edge was perfect. Octavian looked at the hilt, at the chain links, at the medallion fused into the pommel, at the initials on the brass. He looked up at Ethan. The old man's gray eyes, cold, but not empty. There was something in them. Ethan couldn't tell what it was. Octavian asked what it was. Ethan answered, "A dagger." "Made of what?" Octavian asked. "Trash," Ethan replied. The arena was so quiet you could hear the coals crackling in the furnaces. Octavian asked why. Ethan answered, "Because trash is all those who need it most have. Soldiers on the eastern frontier fight with scraps. Children in the slums clench copper coins from their dead fathers in their fists. He doesn't need dragon steel to prove he's a master. He needs to prove that a master is someone who makes weapons from whatever is available for those who need them." Octavian was silent for a long time. Then he turned to the judges. He said one word: "Let's vote." 5 judges, 5 scorecards, quality of materials. Ethan received the lowest scores. Trash is trash, 3s out of 5. Fair enough. Technical complexity, 4s. Smelting in a homemade crucible, carbon hardening, cold-forged medallion inlay. Unconventional, unfamiliar, but technically sound. Beauty of form. Opinions varied here. 2 judges from the guild gave 3s. The royal judge gave a 4. The guest master from across the sea gave a 5. He'd seen similar work in the East. Functionality, 4s from everyone. The dagger worked. It cut. It held its edge. It sprang back. It didn't break. Made from scrap. Soul, silence. 3 judges from the guild. 2 of them raised their scoreboards showing 4s. The third, Octavian, held his scoreboard facing himself. He remained silent. The judge from the court gave a 5. The guest master gave a 5. Octavian slowly raised his tablet. He turned it over. A 5. The arena exhaled. 3,000 people, all at once. Octavian gave a 5 to the orphaned boy, for his soul. Ethan looked at the old man. Octavian was looking at the dagger. Not at Ethan, at the dagger. At the brass medallion bearing the initials of the fallen soldier. At the chain links on the hilt. At the blade made of scrap metal that cut like a razor. Ethan understood. Octavian wasn't giving him a 5. He was giving the object a 5. Because the object was genuine. And the old man, who loved metal more than people, could see that. Scoring. Lyra Farone scored 23 out of 25. The best result among the guild's masters. Master Gravlock scored 21. The rest scored lower. Ethan scored 21. 3rd place. Not a victory, not a defeat. 3rd place out of 12. A street urchin with a dagger from the dump. 3rd place in the grand tournament. The arena roared. The crowd below on the stone benches cheered. Not everyone, but many. Those who themselves were from the slums. Those who themselves had clutched copper coins from their dead fathers in their fists. Ethan didn't look at the stands. He looked at the girl in the third row. He walked up to the railing. He held out the dagger, hilt first, so that the medallion would rest in her palm. He told her it belonged to her father. He was with her now, always. The girl took the dagger with both hands. It was heavy for her, but she held it, tightly, just like she'd held the medallion before. And at that moment, the dagger flared, golden, bright. The light came from inside the blade, from the alloy of nails and chains, from the brass medallion, from her father's memory imprinted in the metal. The arena fell silent. 3,000 people held their breath. The light lasted 3 seconds, then it faded, but everyone saw it. Everyone? Octavian stood in the middle of the arena with a dagger, blood on his finger, and the number 5 in his hand. And for the first time in 50 years, he didn't know what to say. Celesta rose from her seat in the royal box, slowly, back straight, her mother's medallion around her neck. She descended the steps. She walked through the ranks of guards. She stepped into the arena. 3,000 eyes, whispers like the sound of the surf. The third princess, in the arena, walking toward the outcast blacksmith. She stopped in front of Ethan, turned toward the tribune, toward her father, the king, toward the court, toward the guild, toward the whole world. And she spoke loudly, so the entire arena could hear. That Master Ethan works under the patronage of the crown, that his forge is under royal protection, and that anyone who dares to harm him will answer to the throne. The king sat motionless in the stands. His face was stony, but he did not stand up. He did not object. He did not stop his daughter. It was silent consent, or silent shock. Ethan stood beside the princess in the arena before 3,000 people. His hands were dirty. His apron was scorched. The score was 21 out of 25. Third place. Technically, he had lost, but every person in the amphitheater knew that the wrong side had lost. After the tournament, everything changed. Not immediately, not in a single day, but the wave had begun. First, the line at the Rusty Nail tripled in length. Now it wasn't just the poor who came. Small merchants came, mid-level guards, renowned adventurers, even a single baron. Rumors of the dagger from the trash spread throughout the capital within a day. 3 days later, word had reached the provinces. A week later, caravan merchants were carrying the story to the borders. A boy with no family. Third place. From the dump. It shone like gold. Second. The Hammer Guild remained silent. That was more terrifying than any attack. The silence after the tournament meant that Octavian was thinking, and when Octavian thought, he made decisions that changed the world. Third. The rusty waves waited no longer. 2 weeks after the tournament, news arrived from the eastern frontier. The third line of defense had fallen. The beasts had broken through the Silver Pass. It was a 4-week march to the capital, maybe less. The beasts were moving fast. The army was retreating. Swords dissolved in the monster's acidic blood. Soldiers were dying by the dozens. Ethan was working, day and night. Tobin was forging non-stop. Yuna extracted the additives. Borch carried the materials. Hyojin helped at the anvil when Tobin needed a second hammer. Miriam went to the wastelands for a new batch of bones and claws from the first beasts. Ethan realized something important. Ordinary steel dissolves in the creature's acidic blood, but not all of it. The interface showed that alloys with a high chromium content resist corrosion. Stainless steel. On Earth, it was invented in the early 20th century. Here, they didn't know about it. Ethan did. Chromium, nickel, molybdenum. 3 elements that made steel impervious to acid. And all 3 were in the Rusty Nail stockpiles, in the scraps and offcuts that Borch had been collecting for months. Ethan reorganized production. Instead of ordinary infantry swords, he began forging blades from chromium nickel steel. The process was more complicated. The temperatures were higher. The forging was harder. Tobin grumbled under his breath with every blow, but the result was worth it. The blades didn't rust. At all. Ethan conducted a test. He took a sample of acid corrosion from a sword brought in by a soldier. He applied it to a new blade. He waited an hour. Not a trace. Spotless. The metal hadn't even darkened. A Royal Guard officer who saw the result ran to report it to his superiors. By evening, a general was standing in the forge. By nightfall, an order arrived from the court. The Rusty Nail was reassigned to military production. Any resources, any materials, priority access to raw materials, everything needed. Ethan requested scrap iron. A lot of it. Tons. From all over the city. From landfills, from garbage dumps, from old basements. The city delivered it. Borch could barely keep up with sorting it. Ethan scanned it, selected it, showed it to Tobin. Tobin forged it. Yuna extracted chromium and nickel from the ore sent from the royal mines. Hyojin stood by the forge as the second hammerer. The three of them worked together, then 5 of them. Ethan hired 2 more blacksmiths, men who'd lost their jobs after the guild's purge, then 3 more. By the end of the first week, 8 people were working in the forge. Ethan didn't forge himself, he stood in the center. Between the anvils, between the furnaces, between the people. And he spoke, to each one. Strike here! Heat it like this. Hold it this long. Add this. Take that away. A conductor, a factory engineer, someone who knows every step of the process but has others do the work, because his hands are needed for something else. To see. In 3 weeks, Rusty Nail produced 200 stainless steel blades. Each passed the acid test. Each held up. The blades were sent to the Eastern Front. A week later, news arrived. Soldiers with the new swords were holding their positions. The monsters were no longer dissolving the weapons. Casualties had fallen by half. For the first time in half a year, the front line hadn't retreated. Ethan didn't celebrate. He kept working. Because 200 blades are just a drop in the bucket. The army needs 2,000. It needs 20,000. And he has 8 blacksmiths and 1 forge that's cracking at the seams. Celeste came at night. Quietly. Without guards. A locket around her neck. Her face was weary. She said that the king, his father, wanted to speak with Ethan. In person. Tomorrow, at the palace. Ethan looked at his hands, black with soot, covered in fresh burns. He asked if he should wash up. Celeste almost smiled. She said there was no need. Her father must see him as he is. Then she said something else, quietly, almost in a whisper. She said that Octavian Ferone had requested an audience with the king. Also tomorrow, at the same hour. The old man wants to talk, not to fight, to talk. Ethan asked what about. Celeste shook her head. She didn't know. But there was no anger in the old man's voice when he asked for the audience. There was something else. Maybe fatigue. Maybe fear. Maybe what people feel when the world they've spent their whole lives building starts to crumble and they don't know how to fix it. Ethan nodded. Tomorrow is tomorrow. He blew out the horn. He lay down on his mat. Hyojin was sleeping by the door. Tobin was in the annex. Yuna was at the table with her head in her hands next to the crucible. Borsch was snoring in his corner. Miriam returned from the wastelands around midnight. She lay down by the furnace without undressing. A bag of materials was under her head. Ethan stared at the ceiling. 6 months. Half a year in this world. A foreign body had become his own. Strangers had become family. A foreign world had become home. Tomorrow, he would go to the palace. Tomorrow, he would meet with the king, and with Octavian, and everything he had learned about the rusty ways and the guild's waste would be laid out on the table, before both of them. Ethan closed his eyes. The interface flickered gold at the edge of his consciousness, quietly, patiently, as always. Just like on the first day, as if he had been waiting for this moment from the very beginning. Carvin's palace was built of white stone veined with silver. Ethan walked down the corridor, and the interface displayed the composition of each slab beneath his feet. Marble, 94% calcite, 3% dolomite. The silver veins aren't actually silver, they're mica, but it's beautiful. He was wearing a scorched apron, not because he had no other clothes. Celesta had offered him some. He had refused. The apron was his mantle, his coat of arms, his surname, which he didn't have. The throne room was large and empty. The king sat on a dais. An elderly man with weary eyes and a heavy crown. To his right was Celeste. To his left were his advisors. Guards stood by the wall. The interface automatically scanned their weapons. Swords of the Hammer Guild, standard issue, 280 strikes to failure. A crack in the third blade on the left, right at the base of the guard. Ethan noted it mechanically. Habit. Octavian stood in the middle of the hall, alone, without an entourage, without the Supreme Master's chain, in a simple blacksmith's jacket. His old hands clasped in front of him. He turned when Ethan entered. Their eyes met. 2 men who loved metal, in different ways, but with equal intensity. The king spoke first. He said that the rusty waves were at the gates, that the army was holding out only thanks to the new blades from the Rusty Nail Forge, that he needed answers, why ordinary steel was dissolving, why the boys' blades were holding up, and whether the creatures could be stopped. Ethan stepped forward and told him everything. Not about the interface, not about his world. He talked about chemistry, about how the creature's acidic environment contains substances identical to the slag waste from metallurgical production. about how the dead ravines in the east had been receiving defective shipments from the Hammer Guild for centuries, about how, 50 years ago, they had begun dumping experimental alloys with unstable magical impurities there, about how the earth had absorbed it all and responded with the creatures. The throne room fell silent. The king turned pale. The advisors began to whisper. The guards by the walls exchanged glances. Octavian stood motionless. His face was pale. His lips were pressed into a thin line. Ethan took 3 shards of a sword from his pocket, the ones he'd taken from the cart at the armory chamber that first month. He placed them on the floor before the king. He said this was proof. The corrosion on these blades contains the same elements as the slag dumped in the ravines, the same composition, the same proportions, the same impurities. The rusty waves are not a natural disaster. They are the consequence of a 200-year-old crime. Octavian spoke. His voice was steady, dry, and emotionless. He said he knew. Not everything, but part of it. He knew that the guild had been dumping waste. He knew it was cheaper than recycling. He didn't know it was dangerous. No one knew. No one checked. Because checking trash is beneath a master's dignity. Ethan looked at the old man. Octavian wasn't making excuses. He didn't lie. He didn't shift the blame. He stood before the king and spoke the truth that destroyed everything he believed in. His guild, his masters, his ancestors, his sacred craft. All of it had given rise to monsters. Not outcasts, not charlatans, not heretics. Masters, the best of the best, heirs to great houses. They didn't know how to handle what they created, because they looked only at the blade, never at the slag. The king asked what to do. Ethan replied, 3 things. First, stop the disposal, immediately. Everything the guild considers defective must be reprocessed, not thrown away. Every piece of slag contains valuable elements. What they considered trash is worth more than their finest blades, if extracted, if you know how. Second, arm the army properly. Stainless steel, chromium nickel alloys. Ethan can teach any blacksmith the technology in a week. No talent is needed. No bloodline is needed. What's needed is knowledge, the formula, temperatures, proportions. He's ready to pass it all on, for free. Third, open up the craft, to everyone. The Hammerheld has monopolized this knowledge for centuries, passing it down through bloodlines, hiding it from commoners. Ethan wants to create a school, an open one, where students are taught based on talent, not family name. Where a boy from the slums can come and say he wants to learn, and no one will ask whose son he is. The throne room was silent. Octavian stood with his eyes closed, the face of an old man, white hair, a blacksmith's hands, scarred by old burns. For 50 years, he had built a system that was destroying the world. Not out of malice, out of love, out of faith, out of the conviction that the order of blood is the order of the universe. And now, a boy with no surname stood before him and said that the universe was arranged differently. Octavian opened his eyes. He looked at Ethan, for a long time. Then he said 3 words, "Show me how." He didn't order it, he asked. The supreme master of the Hammer Guild, Lyra's grandfather, the man who sent the assassin, the man who had believed his whole life that a child of no lineage could never be a master. He asked the child of no lineage to show him how to save the world he himself had broken. Ethan nodded. A week later, the Hammer Guild opened its doors, for the first time in 400 years. Ethan stood by the guild's main forge and taught. 12 First Circle Masters, the world's finest blacksmiths. They stood around him and listened as the boy in the scorched apron explained why their metal was breaking. Ethan spoke of permissible impurities and fatigue factors. The masters took notes and called it the secret word of metal. Ethan spoke of carbon diffusion saturation. The masters called it the baptism of fire. Ethan spoke of the martensitic structure. The masters called it the crystal of the steel spirit. Ethan didn't correct them. Let them call it whatever they want. The main thing is that they do it right. Lyra stood nearby. She translated his words into the guild's language. She understood more than the others. Not everything, but more, and more with each passing day. Tobin was forging in the guild forge, for the first time in 5 years. He had been brought back, not as a third circle master, but as a mentor. Yuna had been given a laboratory at the academy, a real one, with equipment, a budget, and students. Her research in low alchemy had been officially recognized. 5 years of heresy had turned into 5 years of breakthroughs. Bork had been granted the title of Royal Materials Collector, a ridiculous position they'd invented just for him. He roamed the capital's dumps with a badge on his chest, collecting scrap for the forge. And for the first time in his life, he was respected for it. Hyojin became captain of the field tester squad. Every new blade from the rusty nail passed through her hands. She chopped, she stabbed, parried, broke, and told Ethan what was good and what wasn't. The pair of swords he'd forged for her half a year ago were still in use. Not a scratch, not a chip. 600 battles. The interface had promised 1,200. Miriam returned from the wastelands with the last sack. Not bones, not claws, a skull. Intact. Huge. The skull of an ancient primordial beast. She found it in an abandoned lair deep within the cliffs. She carried it for 3 weeks, alone, through the creature's territory, through the rusty waves. She placed the skull on Ethan's workbench. She said nothing. She just stood there, dirty, scratched, with a scrape across her entire face. Ethan scanned the skull. The interface spewed out so much data that golden lines filled his entire field of vision. Legendary material, one of a kind. From this skull, he could create something that would change the course of the war. Ethan looked at Miriam. She stood there, waiting, as always. No words, no questions. She'd simply brought it. Because he'd asked. Because she knew he'd see value where others saw only bones. Ethan thanked her. Miriam turned away. But she didn't leave. Abby Winslow had come to the Rusty Nail 3 months ago. A merchant. A blacksmith's widow. With a 5-year-old son and debts, she came to propose a partnership and stayed for good. She handled the finances, counted the copper coins, bargained with suppliers, negotiated the best prices. Without her, the Rusty Nail would have gone bankrupt in the second week of war production. Ethan didn't know how to count money. He knew how to count atoms. One evening, Abby brought her son to the blacksmith's shop. A 5-year-old boy with wide eyes. He looked at the bellows, at the anvil, at Tobin with his hammer, at the sparks, at everything. Ethan broke off a piece of a shard from his father's hammer that Abby had been keeping. He heated it, bent it, blowed a hole through it, adjusted the length of the tube so the whistle would play a single note. That very one. The one the boy's father used to hum to him before bedtime. Abby had mentioned it in passing, a week ago. Between the numbers in the ledger, Ethan remembered. The little boy blew the whistle, the note, clear, warm, familiar. Abby stood nearby, unable to focus on the numbers, for the first time in 3 years. Now Abby managed the supply chain for stainless steel blades for the army. 12 forges across the city operated using Ethan's technology. Abby coordinated it all. The Rusty Nail School opened on the first day of spring, an old warehouse building on the banks of the Silver River. Ethan had bought it with money from military contracts. He remodeled it, installed forges, anvils, workbenches, 20 spots. The first intake. Not a single question about last names, not a single question about blood. Just one. Do you want to learn? 40 showed up. Ethan took 20. He told the rest to wait. There would be a second intake, and a third, and a 10th. Among the 20 was a boy from the slums, 13 years old, dirty, hungry, with a shard of a knife in his pocket that he'd found in the trash and sharpened on a rock. Ethan took the shard. He scanned it. Ordinary iron, nothing of value. But the edge was sharp, even, for a boy with no training. Ethan looked at him. The boy looked back. His eyes were hungry. Not for food, for knowledge. Ethan recognized that look. He'd seen it in the mirror, every day, in his past life and in this one. He told the boy to sit down, to watch. He would show him. The rusty waves had retreated by summer. They hadn't disappeared, but they had stopped. An army with stainless blades held the lines. Waste dumping had ceased. Una had developed a method for neutralizing the contaminated soil in the dead ravines. It's a long process. Years, maybe decades, but the groundwork has been laid. Octavian came to the school of the Rusty Nail every week. He would sit silently in a corner. He watched Ethan teach. Sometimes he nodded. Sometimes he shook his head. Once, he approached a student who just couldn't seem to hit the right spot with his hammer. He stood beside him. He placed his old hand over the boy's and guided the blow, precisely, gently, as only a master with 50 years of experience could. Then he returned to his corner. Ethan saw it. He didn't say a word. Some things don't need to be said. One evening, Ethan was sitting alone in the forge. Everyone had left. The horn was smoldering. It was quiet. The skull of the first beast lay on the workbench. Bones nearby. Claws. Fur. Materials for a legendary blade. Ethan examined them every evening. He devised a formula. Changed it. Improved it. The silent answer. That's what he'd call the blade. A sword made from the bones of a creature this world had thrown onto the trash heap. Made from materials the hunters considered waste. From the trash that a certain silent girl from the north had carried across the wastelands because she couldn't bring herself to throw it away. He wasn't ready to forge it yet. Soon. But not today. Today, he simply sat and stared at the golden lines of the interface, an ancient system, a fragment of the consciousness of the last master of the primordial forge. A civilization destroyed by those who founded the Hammer Guild thousands of years ago. The interface had chosen him, not by chance. Not for his strength, for his understanding. Because in his past life, he was the first in centuries to understand matter not as a craftsman, but as a scientist. Ethan touched the golden lines with his fingertips. They shimmered warmly, familiar, like the light in the lab in Pittsburgh, like the headlights of a truck a second before the crash, like the inscription on the side of the truck. Recycling. He remembered. For a second, just for a second, his past life, the lab, his dissertation, the factory, the double shift, the exhaustion, the headlights, darkness, and light, the golden light that had caught him at the moment of death and brought him here. Because a second before the end, he had seen an impossible alloy in the truck, and he had had a single thought. I want to understand this. That thought became the key. Ethan lowered his hand. The golden lines faded. The horn was burning out. The forge was cooling down. Night was falling on Caravan. Quiet. Warm. Smelling of coal and cooling metal. A file lay on the workbench. An old one. That very one. The first tool Borch had thrust into the hands of the orphaned boy 3 years ago. Ethan picked it up. The familiar weight. The familiar texture. He ran his finger along the cutting edge. The interface displayed steel, 1.1% carbon, 0.5% chromium. The file was a good one, better than anything else in Borch's forge. The only truly high-quality item the old drunk had ever bought for the boy. Maybe by chance, maybe not. Ethan put the file back. He stood up. He went out into the courtyard. Stars above his head. Foreign, unfamiliar, but beautiful. He stood there, gazing at the sky of the city that had become his home, at the roof of the blacksmith shop that had become his life, at the light in the window of Yuna's lab. She's awake again. At the silhouette of Hyojin on the roof, keeping watch through the night even though no one asked her to. At the closed shutters of Tobin's room, behind which the old blacksmith sees an anvil in his dreams. Ethan didn't want to go home. He didn't want to go back. For the first time in half a year, he thought about it honestly, and he realized that the answer had been there from day one. From the moment he picked up the file and smiled at the broken sword. His name is Ethan. He has no last name, no lineage, no blood that means anything. He has hands, eyes, knowledge, and people who believe that scrap isn't the end, but the beginning. He returned to the forge, lay down on the straw mat, closed his eyes. Tomorrow would be a new day. New blades, new apprentices, new scrap that would become someone's treasure. Ethan fell asleep, and he didn't dream of the past. He dreamed of the bellows, red hot, the anvil ringing beneath the hammer, and golden lines dancing before his eyes. Lines that said, there is a sword in every piece of rusty iron. There is a story in every scrap. There is a master in every orphan. You just need to know, and know how to look.